Good evening, everyone. Welcome to beautiful downtown Grand Forks City Council's Committee of the Whole for Monday, July 25th. Under item 1, call to order 1.1, welcome and roll call.
Weigel.
Here.
Osowski. Here. Weber.
Here.
Walensky. Kwame. Sandy.
Here.
And Bean.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Great. Under item 2, discussion items, 2.1, electronic scooters ordinance discussion. Mr. Phelan.
Council President Sandy and members of the committee hall, we just want to give you an update, and then I'm going to have my colleague here, Dan Gossett, kind of go through the ordinance and some of the changes. We did have a meeting late last week with Mr. Cavato. I think he's online virtually here for any Q&A. I also followed up with the City of Bismarck. One of the reference sites is the City of Bismarck, and I did follow up with my counterpart in the City of Bismarck. And what I got were, there are a few others, but obviously Bismarck's the closest to us, is they've had a positive experience with the electric scooters. They only have Bird as their company. They have not been in contact with anyone else other than Bird. He said that they've had them for 2 years. It's been a positive experience overall. They've been responsive, and there have been no, significant injuries that he knows of. So, again, it's a 2-year trial run, and he had positives. Not that there aren't any negatives, but they've had a good run of 2 years. This is their second summer, and they feel like positive that they move forward with the experience. The other thing is Mr. Gosta and they did share their agreement that they have with Bird, and I think the service that or the regulatory framework that we're providing is similar to what the City of Bismarck has put in place also. So with that, I'd ask Mr. Gossett just go over some of the particulars of the ordinance changes.
Thank you, Mr. Gossett.
All right, thank you. And just to follow up with what Mr. Phelan said, we did, Bismarck's got a memorandum, actually a memorandum of understanding or a contract with Bird. I didn't want to get into a contract because it somehow feels like you're party to the transaction versus permitting. There are some liability protections with respect to permitting that may not be available if you're a contracting party, so I thought it would better serve to just be permitting these type of businesses rather than entering into a contract with them. But we did review the memorandum of understanding, and the terms, generally the terms are mirror what we've got with respect to the permitting. Again, just to outline it was a Chapter 8 of Article 18. That's the general terms for all electric scooters use, and Council member Osowski, I did look up what a razor is, and I finally figured out what a razor is, and this would apply to razors as well. Just want to briefly go through. We've redlined the changes for you so you can see them. I won't go through all of them, but just a couple I wanted to point out is as far as having running lights, tail lights, brake lights, that's at 8-1802. That relates to scooters that would be used on a street versus on a sidewalk or a bike path. There's a distinction there. At 1803, we also lowered the age as to the use down to age 12, but those that are between 12 and 17 have to have a helmet on. Anybody over 18, then the helmet requirement wouldn't be necessary. At 8-1804, we've now noted where these scooters can be used. They can be used on a street with a posted limit of less than 30 miles an hour, so that would eliminate, the Demers Avenue, Columbia Road, US Highway 2, those major thoroughfares. Also, you can use them on sidewalks, regardless of the speed limit to the adjoining road. Bike pass, shared use pass within the city. One of the items, and I think it was Councilmember Weber brought this up at a previous meeting about use of electric scooters within the downtown area on sidewalks, and that's what that map is. So that in the downtown area, and it shows up better in the electronic version, but it's generally the downtown area that scooters shouldn't be used on sidewalks. Primarily, one of the concerns is you got buildings that you can't see around the corner, and somebody could run into somebody else in the sidewalk in those type of circumstances. With respect to the,
I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
you referred to a map, and I'm looking at both the, I'm not finding it.
it's at page 3 of 13 of the ordinance. It's at 8-1804.
Oh, okay, that map, all right,
Yep.
yes,
And it-
okay,
and-
very good, thanks.
Sure. And so what it does is it excludes scooters within sidewalks within that particular area of the city, downtown. As far as the licensing and regulation, this is where we talked to Mr. Cavuto.
And these are excluded from those sidewalks? It's, you used the word should a moment ago, but they are excluded.
Precluded. Yeah, actually, the term that we
Precluded.
say is that the use of electric scooters on sidewalks shall be precluded in the area indicated by the following map. And the following map is the downtown area.
And help me to understand the legal distinction there. Precluded is different than excluded in,
In my mind, it is not a,
Very good.
not a distinction. As far as the regulatory, this is where we had some input from Mr. Cavuto going through it. A couple of items that I want to point out, again, some of the redlining. First is that 21-1305, subsection 3, it's on page 7. There is an issue as far as they have so many communities that they have these within, and for us to request or have a written notice of insurance or, the insurance sending a cancellation notice, they thought that that may be problematic. So what we did is we included a provision that we can request that they provide us proof of valid insurance. So if you recall, at the time they get the permit, they have to have a certificate of insurance, and that would last for a year. So during that interim period of time, we can always request if we believe that there's an insurance issue. The other is that 21-1310, subsection 15, which is on page 10. The maximum fleet of electric scooters for use within the city of any electric operator is to be established under the city code or under the city permitting process, but shall not exceed, and then we have a blank in there as far as the number of electric scooters. And talked to Mr. Cavuto, and he can probably correct me if I'm wrong. His indication was that he thought it would, somewhere between about 250 is where they would be at with respect to the city of Grand Forks. But again, I'd ask him to comment on that as far as the number. And so those are primarily the changes. The one we did add, you'll also notice that 21-1310, subsection 18, at bottom of page 10, we added a language. And this actually was something Mr. Cavuto shared with us with respect to inclement weather, that they have to remove them from the public right-of-way, and if there's snow events and things like that. So that was something he shared with us, so that was helpful as well. So with that, I also made the other kind of internal reference changes I talked about at the last meeting. Those were corrected with this version as well. So with that, unless you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions, I guess.
Any questions for Mr. Gosted? Mr. Weber? Yes, sir.
Again, on, this is subsection 10 on page 10, under, what is that, 21-1310. All electric scooter rental operators shall remove all electric scooters that are not parked in compliance with this article. This was one of the concerns that was brought up by a citizen last week, that they get left in front of someone's home, whatever. What is our enforcement mechanism for all of this?
It's probably going to be the enforcement mechanism. There is provisions that deal with being able to pick up those scooters. And
Certain hours?
Yes, and also to take them into our possession if they're not parked properly. And I can't remember where the provision is, but it talks about if there are X number of scooters that we've got in our possession because they haven't been parked properly, and after a certain number and a certain number of days, we can revoke their permit at that point.
And this is okay with the operator?
They actually, we sent them this draft on Friday or Monday, I can't remember, but we sent them in advance of tonight's meeting, and I got the response back that everything was fine with them.
Thanks.
Any other comments for the city attorney? Any thoughts in general on the ordinance?
Mr. Sandy,
Yeah, Mr. Weigel.
I was gonna, my thoughts are on it. I think the way that Mr. Gosted and his office reworked a lot of this is a lot better. I think it leans more towards a common sense approach, and I'd be happy to support it.
I'll second.
Was that a motion, Mr. Weigel?
I will, yes.
Second by Weber. There are additional comments?
President
Yes.
Sandy, if you just be mindful that the second reading will occur on Monday.
Correct, at the city council meeting.
Yep.
Exactly. At what point do we make the determination how many scooters each scooter company can have?
You can give me some indication today. Maybe Mr. Cabuto could weigh in and provide you some information
Sure.
on that as well.
I wouldn't know where to start. Sure. Mr. Cabuto, if you...
Members of council, thank you very much for having me. Yes, I'd be happy to provide some additional clarity. Based on the geographic size of Grand Forks, the population size, the presence of UND, the city itself could probably support a fleet of somewhere between 650 to 700 units in total. However, considering that there is some consideration around potentially having multiple operators, potentially at some point in the future, it would be important to make sure there is some limit there. As Mr. Gaustad indicated, I do think that the appropriate number would be somewhere around 250 units, active units per operator. What that means is in order to build in a buffer for units that are being charged, being rebalanced, which is a fancy word for moving them around, etc., you might need closer to around 340 to 350 per operator, with the assumption that no more than 250 would be active at any given time.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Cabuto? None? Mr. Weber? Yeah?
Council President Sandy, I understand that in Bismarck's agreement, they have, they need to have at least 100, in their fleet. And my understanding is they have about 200 in their fleet in Bismarck of the bird scooters. I further understanding that when I asked the city of Bismarck, it doesn't sound like anyone else has followed up with them about any interest in serving this. So it seems like Bird has the market in North Dakota. And so because this is an annual process, we can always kind of look at how things went in a year and then rebalance it. So I anticipate within a year, at least, that we'll come back likely with some modifications based upon our lessons learned through the balance of this year and probably into next.
Okay. Any other comments? I personally am not sold on scooters in the community. I'm still not.
Right.
I'm going to vote to support it today, and I'll probably vote to support it next week, and we'll revisit in a year, and hopefully things will go smoothly. Mr. Weber?
If I may, thank you, President Sandy. So for clarification, are you requesting on line 15 there, where we have to determine a number to put in there? Are you requesting that we put in 300 on that line? Do you want? Is that what you're requesting at this time, sir?
Yes, I believe that would be appropriate. However, we would start with a significantly smaller number of units and scale up to that maximum amount. This would give an opportunity for the community to get a little bit more accustomed to seeing them throughout the streets, throughout the campus, etc., and ensure that once we do reach the maximum amount, this can be turned to as a reliable public transportation option for people throughout the entire jurisdictional boundaries where they can use these scooters.
And Mr. Phelan, you're saying that in Bismarck, your counterpart said that they have 200 scooters, which enables a fleet of 100 out on the street. Am I understanding that right?
What I understand their agreement, they have to have at least 100, but right now they have 200 on the street. And so they set minimums. I think a reasonable number, if I went with a total, because this is an annual, we're going to start somewhere, I think we're only going to have Bird that's going to be involved. I would set the upper limit of 500 in our community, and I would allow up to 250 per private enterprise. And then we can see how that goes. Obviously, we can come back to say we need to adjust some numbers, but I think that's a good starting point for a pilot that we're looking at. And we'll roll out something similar to what they're saying in Bismarck. Bismarck has a larger geographic area. They have more population. However, we do have the University of North Dakota, which is probably the one thing we have in our favor versus Bismarck. So that's what I would set as reasonable parameters. And I'd have Mr. Cavato kind of respond if that would be reasonable.
And let me follow up with you, though. I know the University Student Senate is interested in this and supportive of it. Have we heard from President Armacost and his team? Do they have a number in mind? Have we checked in with them at all?
No, I do know that they have at least a preliminary agreement with the University of North Dakota student government.
Yes.
And I'm not sure if the administration themselves are on board, but it sounds like student government, as we heard, really want to move forward with, at least giving it a try.
And so,
I apologize for the interruption, but for clarity, we do have an executed agreement with the University of North Dakota, their administration.
good. Okay. Mr. Weigel, did you want to include a number in your motion, or did you want to leave that empty for now?
Can we leave it empty now, Mr. Weber, until next week? I'd like to chat with the university administration to kind of see what their number they're thinking. I personally think 500 is maybe too many, but I could be wrong and would maybe like more information.
That was my sense as well, but I like that approach. That sounds good to me. I'm ready to vote when others are.
Just, Council President Sandy, just for clarification, if you take a look at that provision, it talks about the number of electric scooters that will be used by any operator will be established under the permit, but not to exceed a certain threshold. So the permitting process, I think, would allow that flexibility to say we'll start with 150, move up to 200, 250, but then once you've hit that maximum, that's it. That would top it out. So,
Thank you, Mr. Gosted. Any other comments for the good of the order? Yes, Mr. Veen?
Yeah, maybe I didn't see it in here, but can they locate these on public sidewalks when they're in their storage? You know, when they'll all be lined up and you want to rent them, or do they? What type of location can they be in? Like at the university, I'm assuming they'll be on university property and they'll get permission from the university. When you're downtown, where do they get the permission about where and how many?
in the requirements for the operator, they have to put together a plan as far as their parking is concerned. And so if they are, I guess, going to start using public or right-of-ways, they'll have to have that plan, and that'll have to be approved by the city in order to have those parking stations on city-owned property.
And who would the city be? Is there administratively that taken care of?
Yes, we've identified the city administrator and/or the city administrator is designated to work through the permitting process.
I guess I have a comment. I don't like it. I don't like putting regulations on our children just to allow a corporation to come in and make money. And I mean, I don't think that our children personally would own any of these more heavy-duty type scooters, so I don't really understand why they need to be put in here. And then also, you know, we also have hoverboards and different types of toys that people use to get around. Are we going to expand these laws to or this ordinance to them also?
We certainly can.
I don't want to, but
Does this ordinance do that? This draft ordinance?
Ordinance deals with electric scooters.
It doesn't deal with hoverboards or Segway, for example.
Does not.
Right, it does not. Scooters. Any other comments, thoughts? We'll get another bite at this apple next Monday. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Osowski dissents. Thank you. Item 2.2, appointment for the library board. Mr. Phelan?
Council President Sandy and members of the committee hall, we have Mr. Paul Sum, or Dr. Sum, is who the recommendation from Mr. Buczynski, or Mayor Buczynski. He did also apply for planning and zoning, also Mr. Sum, so we did interview for both positions. He's interested in engaging more with city government, so we, as an alternative, and Mayor Buczynski did also interview others, we thought, Dr. Sum or Mr. Sum would be a great candidate, and looking at his resume, or his vitae, I think is what you call in the academic world, it certainly is impressive, and I think will be a really good addition to city government. And I just say, there were other candidates that were equally really great, and it's really fun to see a lot of people want to get involved in city government.
Thank you. Any thoughts? Mr.
I'll move
Weber?
approval of
moves
Dr.
approval.
Sum, please.
Dr. Sum, is there a second? Second by Veen. Any other comments? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries unanimously. Item 2.3, we're going to create special assessment districts for newly annexed properties.
Good evening, President Sandy, members of the committee. I'm going to introduce you to a new face tonight. Emily Fossen has retired, and Samantha Bergen here is going to speak to the item. She's doing a wonderful job filling Emily's role, and I'm going to let you take it from here. Thank you.
All right, President Sandy, members of the committee, so this is the normal time of year that we bring forward future special assessment districts. All of these projects are from projects that were approved by council before and had a future special assessment area that we are now applying to the new annexations that became legal in 2022. So if you have any questions about any specific.
Mr. Orsted, Mr. Gosta, do we need to read every one of these in for the record?
We do not.
Very good. Any thoughts on Mr. Veen, questions?
Yeah, a basic question which relates to all of these. We are currently paying like specials on each one of these, and now they will go back to the actual property owner, is that right?
Mr. Veen, members of the committee, if I'm understanding your question correct, so we are making bond payments on the special assessment bond that these are associated, and now that these come on board, we get reimbursed by the property owner for what we have covered on those special assessment payments.
I mean, so there's a financial benefit once we get these the assessments being paid by those property owners, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So in general, any rough idea what this impact is?
For which?
For all of them? I mean, because it's a savings that we're not having to pay right now.
Mr. Veen, maybe, I don't know that I'm completely understanding your question. If you give me, we can run some numbers for you by project. I don't have any numbers in total.
I'll check with you after.
Okay, perfect, thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Special assessment districts, standard operating procedure? Anyone? Moved by Weber. Great. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Veen. Any other comments or questions? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Welcome to the team. Thank you. Item 2.4, Beacon by Epic City Board members' appointments. Mr. Phelan, usual suspects tonight.
It is, it's usual suspects, but it's a really important project. This is was the Beacon by Epic project. As you know, that there's one building that's almost has gone up 7 stories. The other building has started, and there's going to be a third building. And these are all mixed-use buildings, commercial on the first and second floors, apartments with a mix of condos. And so, as you recall, the city owns the public plaza space, and the city council and the other taxing entities approved a TIF revenue bond of 25 years. with an 80% exemption that would help pay for that bond. Marine's done a preliminary calculation, it's plus or minus, that value brings about $7 million. In the budget, we had a discussion about this a week or so ago, is that we've also set aside about $1.1 million in some of our cash for public quality events or beautification. In addition, we are working with Epic right now about what that estimate will be for the public plaza. And so we'll be bringing that back, and certainly we want to make sure it's got a great stage and a great sound system, that it has turf, and one of the gems of this, similar to the lights, and this is really mirrored off of the lights, and if you've been down to the West Fargo lights, this is going to be a little bit bigger than the lights in West Fargo, and there'll be a nice synergy between the two. But the other part is the hockey or ice skating rink that we want to really share with the high schools and UND and others. We're going to have to take a look at what that's going to cost and find ways to do that. But we're still in the kind of the value engineering, all that. That's kind of the centerpiece of this whole thing. So that's where we're at with that. And we've been working on who would be the best. And as the staff report says, you know, there's a 9-member committee, 3 from the city, 3 from the school, 2 from the Park District, and 1 from the Beacon Events, Inc., which is of which we have that almost 5-year agreement with to run the system. You should think of this similar to the Alaris Center, where the city owns the facility, but we have somebody else manage it. And as you recall, when we did approve this, we talked about other management companies, but it's the city council really bought off. If Epic is going to own and operate this up front, that let's give them an opportunity to manage that facility, just because it's going to be incredibly important to have it run really well, because it'll really move their private investment too. So with that, and working with Mayor Buczynski, we did ask 3 individuals from 3 organizations. Number 1 would be Julie Rigg from the Visit Greater Grand Forks, and we really want to have her engaged as part of this startup to really look at events that can go there, not only existing events, but maybe new events. The second organization was the Downtown Development Association, and then we had Blue Weber, who's the CEO and president. Mr. Weber has asked that Savea Benfield, who's the VP of their marketing, could substitute for him in that. And we really want the DDA to be involved so that we don't have competition. This should be a greater something, and that we're still going to program the town square, but this is another great public event space that we can really move ourselves to the next level. So it should be an and not an or, and so we wanted to get them engaged. And then finally, we asked Jody Hodson, who's the general manager of the Ralph Engelson Arena, and obviously they're involved in events, and because the hockey and ice skating is really a centerpiece of this, we wanted to have his expertise as part of that opportunity. So as part of the recommendation, if you're so inclined to move forward, I would say the individuals here, I would name and their organizations or their representative from their organizations. Like for instance, in the DDA, if they decide that it's not going to be Will Weber, but it's going to be somebody else, I think we just need somebody from their organization, and we just start at the top of their organization or their representative. So with that, I'd ask Mr. Gosted to go any of the fine details too.
Mr. Gosted?
Thank you. And Mr. Phelan stated it correctly. We haven't quite bought the plaza yet. If you recall, we don't have to pay for it until 2 of the buildings are up, and then we have to pay 2/3 of the purchase price, and then the remaining 1/3 gets paid once the final building is constructed. But we've already developed the purchase agreement for that with the developer, so that's all done. We just haven't affected it yet because it's a ways out yet before we have to close. And then the management, we've already negotiated that management agreement. That was part of the TIF agreement too, if you recall. And Beacon Events, Inc. was the entity that was designated to be the management company that would manage the public plaza. After we got into the negotiation, we discovered that we wanted representatives from the Park District, the Park School District, and the city to be on the board of directors of this nonprofit corporation that was created by Epic. And so in the meantime, after that got done, part of your packet was articles of amendment that changed the articles of incorporation for this nonprofit to make it clear who the board of directors would be. And so we'll appoint 3. The initial appointments, one will have a 1-year term, another one will have a 2-year term, and the third will have a 3-year term, so you have a staggering. After that, everybody will serve as a 3-year director. I envision that the board of directors would not run the day-to-day operation. They would end up hiring probably an EPIC to do more of the management, similar to like what Mr. Phelan said with the Alaris Center. You've got the Alaris Center Commission that doesn't do the day-to-day, but they've hired Spectre, or their successor entity runs the day-to-day operation, similar type of format. The school district has appointed by position their activities director, their buildings and ground director, and superintendent of schools are their 3 appointees. The park district appointed Steve Hell, their parks operation manager, and Wes Colburn, their facilities manager, as their selected. And so with these 3 selections, the board would be virtually complete. EPIC, the developer, gets 1 member of the board of directors as well on this entity. I hadn't envisioned doing this at this point. The management agreement hasn't been signed either, but it's been fully negotiated. It's done, because we don't need the management agreement until the public plaza is operational. But it's completed with respect to the negotiation. I had anticipated having these appointed directors until later, but there has to be another amendment to the Articles of Incorporation for some tax purposes that they need to include a provision, and you can only do that through board of director action. And since we've already created who's going to be on the board of directors for the first amendment, we need another amendment that needs to be done. So that's really the reason why we're doing this now. Plus, it gives some advantage of having that group gather now and start getting ready, tee up when the management really starts going into place. So with that, if you have any questions for me, that's the reasoning.
Any questions from Mr. Costed? Yeah, Mr. Veen.
So is there, maybe it's not a part of what you're asking, the management fee, is that established? That used to be, I thought, a line item in here.
The management fee is within the management agreement itself. I don't think that there is a number in there for the management fee, but if you recall, the Beacon Events, Inc., their operational budget has to be approved by the city council on an annual basis, and that number would be inserted in there. And my expectation, the management fee, you wouldn't pay the Beacon Events, Inc., you'd pay their underlying, EPIC that's actually doing the day-to-day. So you'll see that once you see the operating budget.
Yeah, so that'll come back to us.
Correct.
And I think Council Member Veen, I think that's important, getting this board going, getting the revenues over expenses and all the things that are going to have to go on from just simple operating expenses to sponsorship. There is in this current agreement that the city would provide upfront funding of up to $85,000 for startup to buy some of the stuff to get the facility going. And so there is a commitment from the city as part of that, just to get things moving forward.
Ms. Osowski?
Yeah, I guess I don't really know much about this project. Like, where is this located at?
It's the old Townhouse Hotel.
Oh, okay.
Right downtown.
Okay, and then, so how much of this are we going to fund, the city?
The first $85,000 is startup, and then after that, there's an operating budget. They should be generating revenue from shows and rentals and whatever else that's operated out of this public plaza. That operating budget then comes before the city council on an annual basis, and it has to be approved.
So just like another little Alaris Center that'll continuously cost us money?
Great analogy.
Okay.
I don't know if it costs money, and the management agreement also provides that the city is not obligated if there are net losses to make up those net losses.
And just to explain to everybody, remember we did a TIF revenue bond, so when I talk about this, the approximately $7 million, so what we agreed to as part of the tax incentive is that 80% of that tax incentive would go to fund the upfront capital of the public plaza. And so that 80% is supporting a capital investment of about $7 million. The other 20% is going to all the various taxing entities, including the city of Grand Forks. And then, of course, this management agreement was really set up to host larger and larger and better events to really intentionally, obviously it's going to serve the private development. It's also going to serve the community by bringing other larger acts, more entertainment to our community, and drive the local economy. I would say the Beacon by Epic, if you look at the 3 buildings plus the public plaza, it's north, this development's north of $50 million investment when it's all said and done. So if you looked, extrapolated what it was during the pandemic to where it is today, it's a well over $50 million investment in these buildings and the public square itself. So it's exciting that it's still moving forward, and I suspect it's gotten a little tighter with all the inflation that we've seen.
Any other comments or questions, thoughts? Mr. Weber?
Yeah, I'd like to make the council aware, or this committee aware of a potential conflict. I have a family member who's currently listed. It's been discussed already that we would possibly just have the organizations choose who would be represented, but right now I have a family member listed on the staff report, and so I'd ask the committee to consider whether or not I should be allowed to vote.
Any thoughts on Mr. Weber voting? Mr. Veen?
Let me be clear, I mean, we're not nominating anybody, you're nominating an entity, is that right?
Council President Sandy, I think I started out nominating the individual from the organization, but I think as part of the motion, if you could approve the people that I've noted and the organization, or an equivalent representative right now.
Any thoughts regarding Mr. Weber being able to vote, Mr. Veen?
I don't know what the motion would, let me, go ahead, Mr.
I can actually weigh in. I don't think it's a conflict, Mr. Weber, just because you are not appointing your family member. It's a appointment of an individual within the DDA or the DDA representative. So I don't necessarily see that as a conflict. Your vote isn't going to impact whether your compensation or anything like that. I just don't see that as being a conflict at all. So
I would tend to agree. Okay, so anyone want to approve the board members as read, the board members as recommended by the mayor?
I'll move.
Yeah, Mr. Veen moves approval. Is there a second? Second.
Second.
Second by Lunsky. Thank you, Mr. Weigel. Any other comments? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Item 2.5, engineering agreement for project 8549, upgrade pump station 184. Ms. Severson, good evening.
Good evening, President Sandy, members of the committee. This project is an upgrade to the controls and drives at Storm Sewer Pump Station 184. Pump Station 184 is located at 5474 6th Avenue North. The last rehab at the station was done in 2003. Our typical city practice is to do it every 15 to 20 years. You'll notice in the budget, we originally had 197, but it was noted that this one was priority. So staff is, the estimated construction cost is $750,000. Staff is recommending to approve the task order agreement with WFW for design, bidding, and construction in the amount of $89,565.
Great. Any questions for Ms. Severson?
Move approval.
Moved by Veen. Is there a second? Second by Weber. Any other comments? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. 2.6, federal funding project, safe streets and roads for all, project 8540. Mr. Krenko, good evening.
Good evening, President Sandy and members of the committee. What I have before you this evening is a new federal grant program that is out there. There is $1 billion in available federal funding under this program on an annual basis for about the next 5 years. This is a competitive grant program that is on a 80% federal share, 20% local share, and the funding is split into kind of two different categories. One is focused more on comprehensive safety action plan development, and the other is for implementation grants. And the implementation grants In order to be eligible for that, you have to have a comprehensive safety action plan in place. Right now, we do not have a comprehensive safety action plan that meets all of the requirements, and so what we're proposing this evening is a joint application with the MPO as well as East Grand Forks to apply for a comprehensive safety action plan as a joint application. In webinars that I've attended, having multiple jurisdictions in on a single application tends to be favorably viewed. And in initial conversations with staff from the MPO as well as East Grand Forks, that has been favorable, as well as this has been brought up at the July 20th MPO Exec Board meeting, and this will be going to the East Grand Forks, I believe their work session tomorrow evening for discussion. This would include approval of the application as a joint applicant, as well as a draft of the MOU, which is still being reviewed by our city attorney, as well as MPO and East Grand Forks. Overall, we would be looking at an application for about $500,000 for this comprehensive safety action plan. This is a reimbursement style grant, so we would have to do the work up front and cash flow it up front as a city, and then we would be reimbursed afterwards with the 80% federal share. Overall, considering there's a $500,000 cost estimate on this one, and the costs would be split between Grand Forks and East Grand Forks 50-50, our end share at the end of the day would be about $50,000 for this. And with that, staff is recommending approving, submitting the application with East Grand Forks and the MPO as a joint applicant, as well as the upcoming memorandum of understanding contingent on review by the city attorney, East Grand Forks, and the MPO.
Thank you, Mr. Krenko. Any questions or concerns, thoughts, Mr. Weber?
I'm excited to see this moving forward, and what a great partnership between MPO and our two cities. I'll move approval.
Great. Motion by Weber. Is there a second?
I have some questions, I guess. So,
Certainly. I'm sorry, Ms. Osowski, I'm looking for a second first.
Oh.
Is there a second? Thank you, Mr. Veen. Now, Ms. Osowski, yes, ma'am?
Okay. How often do you have to come up with the new safety plan? Is this just a one and done type thing? Because I read through here and it says that we'll have to pay, what, the $500,000 to a consultant to come up with the safety plan?
Yes, we would likely end up hiring a consultant for this plan, and then in order to be eligible for the implementation grants, your plan would have to be no older than 5 years.
Okay, and so you stated that the $1 billion is for 5 years, correct? That's how long?
No.
So that's how long this grant is available right now, right?
Right now, the grant itself, it's $1 billion annually, and I believe that is currently on the docket for the next 5 years.
Okay, so it's not guaranteed that we'll get this money if we pay a consultant? Like that will qualify for the grant?
We would likely get awarded the funding first, and then we would end up hiring a consultant. So we'd get a notification that we were awarded funding. We would have to hire the consultant. We would end up paying the consultant up front, and then once the project would be done, then we would go for reimbursement. So we would know well in advance that we had federal funding available for it before we would proceed forward.
Great. Are there other questions? So there's a motion and a second. Hearing no other questions, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign.
There's a motion.
Motion carries unanimously. Thank you, Mr. Krenko. Item 2.7, Fu Feng Development Agreement Overview and Update. Mr. Phelan.
Council President Sandy, members of the committee whole, if I could just give you a summary, we're going to go, I think from 2.7 all the way through 2.12 are a little bit interlinked, if not a lot interlinked. So from 2.7 and 2.7.1, we're going to ask Mr. Gosted to go over the development agreement and then provide an update on where we're at with those various component parts of that. And I think that overall and overview will instruct as we go through the various items on how that relates to the development agreement itself. Under 2.8, we have asked Mr. Sean Gaddy of AE2S and Mr. Paul Borsman, who's on virtually from Black and Beach, to give us an update on 3 specific areas of wastewater pretreatment: thermal, plume, and odor. And then under 2.9, we're going to ask Al Grasser is going to introduce another consultant from Bolton and Mink named Mike Bittner. He's going to give you the traffic study update. The difference with the 2.9 is we are going to ask you to receive and file that traffic study so that we can move forward with finalizing that as part of an MOU. And then under 2.10, Al Grasser is going to lead the development team through the wastewater and the stormwater part, and then Melanie Parvey and I from water under 2.11 and 2.12 for the raw water booster, and then the wastewater treatment plant CMAR. And I just want to highlight all those things behind the scenes, what we're working on. All of these infrastructure component parts have a funding mechanism on these. And so as we start moving forward with these, we are working, we're going to work with the North Dakota DOT on the transportation improvements and working on not only getting the projects moving forward, but also on the cost share. So that'll be some next steps there. The North Dakota Department of Water Resources, so when you look at the raw water booster, currently they're funding 60% of that raw water booster, so we will continue to move forward with the state in partnership with that. And then when you look at these stormwater projects and the wastewater projects, we are, in the wastewater treatment plant, we're going to be working with the Department of Environmental Quality, both on the water and wastewater SRF side. We're going to be working with the Bank of North Dakota on the infrastructure loan program, and we're still going to really push, as you recall, on the sanitary sewer, you as City Council, and we recommended that the city pay for the sanitary sewer for all the adjacent areas on 81, so we will have to work on that loan forgiveness. The state of North Dakota is still developing guidelines, and so we intend to meet up with the state here in the near future on all those various, with those various departments and all the various funding mechanisms as we move forward. And we're going to talk some about Fufang and the development agreement, but always keep in mind that we did annex the larger area and that we did have a commitment to annex the area. And obviously, as part of annexation, we're trying to serve not only Fufang, but the adjacent Highway 81 area too as we move forward. And then the final piece is that wastewater treatment plant is really meant to service the entire city, and that was already planned. So that's kind of sets up the kind of where we're going to go from here over these next several items. So with that, I'd ask Mr. Gostead to go provide us the overview.
Mr. Gostead.
All right, thank you, Council President Sandy and council members. I'm going to give you an update on a variety of things that have occurred under the development agreement. First is Fufang did submit their CFIUS declaration filing today. It was submitted under what is called 31 CFR Part 800 to deal with a covered control transaction, and that's to determine whether there's been a merger, acquisition, or takeover that could result in a foreign control of a U.S. business. There is also the filing that could be made with respect to how close it is in proximity to the airbase, but that's a geographic distance, and our attorney has indicated that it's 1 mile distance is what the parameter is under its Part 802, and so they filed under the more subjective filing with respect to this covered control transaction. So at this point, we'd be waiting for CFIUS to get back in their determination as to whether this is something that they have jurisdiction over.
Sorry, Mr. Gostead.
Yes.
Do we have any sense of how rapidly they will come to a decision on or provide feedback related to this?
We do. Our attorney has indicated that it's about a 30 to 45 day period of time in which CFIUS is required to make a decision. So it's a fairly quick turnaround.
And Mr. Gostead, one more question. Is there any reason why we should stop what we're doing? Is the city at any financial risk if we continue moving forward with the projects? Should CFIUS come out and say that what we're doing is not a good idea?
That's the very purpose of the letter of credit, is we've got the
That's
funding.
not true, Mr.
If we've got
I can share that information with you if you're welcome.
Sorry, please, Mr. Gostead, please.
Thank you. The letter of credit is intended to cover the transaction if there's an event of default or if there's a termination event, as specified. I think it's under, I've memorized it now, it's sections 8.5, section 9.5, and section 11.2.2 of the development agreement. That's what
They get their money back.
Excuse me.
There is a government shutdown. You renegotiated that.
May I
Mr.
continue?
Gosted,
Thank you.
please.
It's difficult to try to get my point across with the interruptions that occur repeatedly. The letter of credit is in place. We've drafted it in the manner that if there is a event of default, if there is an event of termination where a condition isn't satisfied, that's what the letter of credit is intended to do. So it really is a risk on behalf of Fufang, because we've gotten the letter of credit and that's attached, and we'll talk about that in a bit.
Thank you, Mr. Gosted. Please continue.
Okay, thank you.
Council President?
Yes, Mr. Webber.
Could I ask a clarifying question on what you've said? Regarding the CFIUS review, there were two types of review. One was more territorial, based on distance. There's no point in doing that because if it's beyond a mile, they just don't even review it. Is that accurate?
That's what the attorney has represented to us, is that there is, the Part 802 is geographic distance, and our attorney has advised that it's a 1 mile distance from the military base under the CFIUS regulations.
And the other type is more focused on foreign interest being involved in a business entity, and that's the CFIUS review that has been applied for at this time. Is that right?
Correct.
Very good, thanks.
I think it's, Mr. Gosted, could you point out what happens during that review? What does CFIUS do?
That I don't know, other than they get the application. I don't know precisely all the ins and outs of their review process. I think they send it to other various federal agencies for their analysis and for their recommendation as to whether this is something that fits within the CFIUS review process.
Thank you, Mr. Gosted.
All right. There is a couple of litigation cases I want to update the council on. First is the ballot petition litigation. I know I've talked about this before, that there are really two cases that were commenced. One is called a mandamus case, where the petitioners are asking that the court mandate that the city conduct a vote. The second is a case that's entitled, it's an appeal of a decision of a governing body, where the requested relief is to overturn the decision that was made not to put this to a vote. There are our attorneys, Scott Porsberg and Brian Schmidt, were retained through the Insurance Reserve Fund to represent the city. They filed motions on June 21st of this year. In the mandamus case, they filed a summary judgment motion, which means there aren't any material facts at issue. The court can make that decision without, there aren't any facts that a jury would require to ferret through. The judge can make the decision. That summary judgment motion is to request that the court deny the petition to mandate a vote. With respect to the appeal of a decision of a governing body, that's a motion to dismiss that was filed on the very same day to dismiss the case. After a couple of extensions that were granted to the petitioners, they have until July 28th to respond to those motions. And then the city would have until August 11th to submit a reply brief on both of those motions. There is a scheduling conference set for August 9th. Which will kind of set the parameters as to the scheduling of the case going forward. I know there's one issue that remains, there's a request to consolidate the two cases, and I think they'll have a discussion with the court on the consolidation. There hasn't been a ruling on that yet, and I think the judge will have that discussion at that status conference. Also, there's a hearing on the petition for the mandamus. That's set for August 18th of 2022 at 1 p.m. at Devil's Lake, because that's where the judge is located. And that's going to be on the petition for the mandamus, and it also will address the summary judgment motion that's pending as well. The other case that is pending is the annexation case that was brought by Dennis Cadillac. The complaint was dated June 30th. We were served on July 1st. The basis of the claim is that Mr. Cadillac asserts that he should have received notice of the annexation because he owns to the center of US Highway 81. He sought a temporary restraining order to preclude the annexation from going forward. Our attorneys, again, Scott Forsberg and Brian Schmidt, were retained through the Insurance Reserve Fund to represent the city. And they responded on July 6th, 2022, asking that motion for a restraining order be denied. Part of the analysis is that we were able to locate that in May of 1949. There's a deed to the state for US Highway 81. There's multiple reasons, but that's one of the facts that we're able to discover. An answer to the complaint was filed last week, and today I received notice that there's a hearing on the restraining order that's set for October 3rd of 2022 here in Grand Forks. That'll be before Judge Don Hager, who has been assigned to that case. With respect to, there's item 2.7.1 of the agenda deals with the amendment to the development agreement. This concerns the letter of credit. As I already spoke about, the letter of credit is to stay in place until the plant is substantially completed and Fufeng is paid what are described as pre-special assessment costs. I'll talk about the special assessments in a bit. Under the letter of credit, which is also attached as part of the amendment documents, it was issued by MUFG Bank, and it automatically renews every June 24th for another one-year period of time, except that the bank can send out a non-extension notice, which has to be received at least 60 days before the expiration date. That was requested by the bank with respect to the letter of credit. As part of the negotiation within the letter of credit is that we can now not only tap into or draw on the letter of credit if there's an event of default or there's that termination event, but also if Fufeng does not then find a replacement letter of credit with the same terms and conditions. Fufeng has to do that within 45 days after we receive that non-extension notice from the bank. So it gives us that 15-day window if they don't find that replacement to then make a draw on the letter of credit. This non-extension and non-replacement drawing was not in the development agreement itself. And so in order to make the development agreement and the letter of credit mirror one another as to the drawing events, the amendment became necessary. Because under the development agreement, it was only if there was an event of default or a termination event. And now we've got a third situation is the bank sends out that non-extension notice, Fufeng doesn't get a replacement letter of credit. That's another basis for the city to then obtain or make a draw on that $5 million letter of credit. As part of that negotiation in the amendment, Fufeng then requested that, or stated that they may not seek a replacement letter of credit, but rather deposit $5 million into an account in lieu of the letter of credit. And so the amendment addresses that possibility. But the amendment says they have to do that within 30 days after we receive that non-extension notice. So we have to get it 60 days in advance. They'd have to deposit that money within 30 days. If they don't do that, then their last alternative is to get the letter of credit at least 45 days after we receive that non-extension notice. So we're still within that 60-day window for us to draw on the letter of credit. And so what we did is we developed escrow agreements so that if we draw on the letter of credit because there's been a non-extension and this non-replacement, but there may not be an event of default or a termination event, we deposit the money into an escrow account, and if there's a later default or termination event, we can tap into the funds that are held. And we also did that, sent up another escrow agreement if the Fufang then actually deposits the money rather than going out and get a letter of credit. Those escrow funds would serve in the same capacity as the letter of credit, except now it's a bank account instead of a letter of credit. Fufang has agreed to all the terms and conditions of this amendment and the escrow agreement, so that's all been taken care of. We just waiting for city council approval for these. And that's one of the action items that will be, that's item 2.7.1 on tonight's agenda. A couple other items that I want to raise is that with Agassiz Rural Water, if you recall, we entered into an agreement with them to move some of their existing pipes that were right down the middle of the Fufang property to put it within the right-of-way within the annexation area, within the platted area, to move the pipes so they're not right down, smack down the middle of that property. That's been fully executed, and under the agreement, we're just simply moving those pipes. Agassiz will continue to service those customers until the city's water system gets put into place. And then we'd be then negotiating with Agassiz with respect to the buyout of those particular customers going forward. And so we've started those discussions as well. As far as natural gas, One Oak has reached out to me and to others in the city about wanting to get into an agreement with respect to the placement of their pipes within the city's right-of-way area. They either want some sort of license or encroachment agreement. We haven't developed that yet, but we're in the process of doing so. Or starting anyways, that process. We'll also need some sort of agreement with respect to the sales of that natural gas to Fufang.
If I may. So we had the First Amendment Development Agreement. That's item 2.7.1. And then you talked about the movement of the Lake.
Sorry, Mr. Rimmer?
Yes, please.
Yep. There is no 2.7.1 on the agenda. There's 2.7A, 2.7A, and 2.7B. There is no 2.
I have, maybe I'm looking at I opened this up just prior to our meeting, and I'm seeing an item 2.7.1 Fufang.
Really?
First Amended Development Agreement, and I'm not seeing any agenda items regarding the other items you're discussing.
You're not going to see that because those have already been approved. I'm just giving you an update as to the status of those.
Do we need to make a motion on the, do we need to approve the amended development agreement?
Yes.
Can we do that? When would you like us to do that?
I can get done with my presentation and then that might be the appropriate time to do a motion.
Very good. I was confused that I wasn't seeing the other items, but thank you. Thanks for the clarification.
The other thing I want to update, and these are agreements that I'm thinking through as we work through the development agreement and through the process here, other agreements that will be forthcoming to the council at some point in time in the future. One is utility service contracts dealing with raw water and wastewater. Those have to be developed. Those are going to be important agreements. Tonight, you're going to hear discussions about MOUs. Those are discussion points with respect to various components, infrastructure components, dealing with both construction and the operation of those particular infrastructure components and what the expectations are of Fufang with respect to their construction, meaning they told you that this is how they're going to construct it, this is how they're going to operate it, and then we're going to memorialize that in MOUs going forward. So we have documentation of that as well. The next is an agreement with the county with respect to their ARPA contribution with respect to the wastewater. There is a $3 million commitment by the county. I want to memorialize that in some memorandum of understanding as well. There's also going to come forward a acquisition of the lot. I think it's lot 3 of the platted property. This is to purchase that lot for the stormwater that services both the Fufang property and the greater annexation area. And there's a formula under the development agreement as to how much to pay for that particular lot. It's based upon the area that's served by the stormwater pond, Fufang's area, and the other areas that are served, and there's compensation that gets paid for that. Also in the your packet in the agenda, there is the conditions and requirements task list. That's a spreadsheet that my office put together that ties into the development agreement, all the conditions that have to be satisfied and the status, and there's a column with respect to notes that gives kind of an update as to where things are at, and where, at a column that says when things have been completed. That's part of the packet as well. And that's my method of tracking that, whether a condition has been satisfied or not, or where things are at in each of the items.
And I'm sorry again, does that exist in a spreadsheet?
It does.
Then? What item is that?
It is under 2.7B, called Development Agreement Conditions Requirements Task List.
I'm going from 2.7 to 2.71 to 2.8. I do not have a 2.7B. 2.7B, it's right there.
2.7B.
The conditions for quick, and it's a spreadsheet. Fantastic. Okay, thanks. There's a lot of information here. I appreciate the clarifications. Thanks.
I won't go through the spreadsheet. It's about 16 pages long, and it's 11 by 17 to be able to see it well. So
yes.
There's been some time spent in getting information from both our consultants as to where they're at in the various tasks as well.
But this is available to the public. This is on the staff report. Anyone can go in and look at this.
Yes.
Yes, thanks.
I haven't seen it.
This is available to the public. It's on the tonight's
It's on the
calendar.
city's website.
It's right
It's
here.
on the calendar.
Whether people have seen it or not, this is available to the public. Thanks.
And Council President, we also attached the development agreement that is associated with the checklist.
Thank you.
Is that the most current?
And then,
Go ahead, Mr. Gusta.
thank you. You're going to see,
It is the most current one.
Thank you.
it's really difficult, President Sandy, to get through this without being interrupted constantly. It's rude. The next item you're going to see is that there are special assessment districts that are being created. I just wanted to go back and how this relates to the development agreement. Under North Dakota Century Code 40-2401, special assessments become a lien on the property that are being assessed, second only to property tax liens. They take precedent over any other lien except for general property taxes. The reason that becomes significant is because costs that may be incurred before the special assessment district are created can't be assessed. So we address that in the development agreement because there are some costs that are being incurred that could be assessed through the special assessment district, but because we haven't created the district yet, they couldn't be. And so Section 7.2.2 of the development agreement covers these kind of pre-special assessment district costs that if the plant is substantially completed, Fufang then pays their percentage of benefit for those costs, and the city absorbs the balance of it. But if it's not substantially completed, Fufang pays 100% of those pre-special assessment costs. So the need for creating the special assessment district now is to start incurring those costs that would be assessable under the special assessment district. And as I understand, a lot of these, or I think all of the special assessment projects are things that would be for the annexed area in total, not just necessarily for Fufang. But again, the letter of credit is also to be utilized if there's an event of default or a termination event, because those pre-special assessment costs are specifically identified as something that could be recovered through the letter of credit as well. The last item is the raw water facilities, and this is more Fufang related. And of course, at this point, not all the conditions are satisfied under the letter of credit. But again, we've dealt with that in the development agreement under Section 8.3, that some work can be done before all the conditions are satisfied. This requires council approval. That's why it's before you tonight. These type of items are on a case-by-case basis, and the fact, under the development agreement, the fact that you might approve This doesn't mean it's a waiver of all the other conditions. It's a one-time approval matter. And again, the letter of credit, it's specifically mentioned in sections 8.5, 9.4, and 11.2.2 that if there's an event of default or there is an event of termination, those costs that would be incurred for these type of projects could be recovered through the letter of credit. So it's a lot of information for me. I apologize for the length of time, but if you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer any of them.
And Council President Sandy, 2.7 was intended as an update, and then the next item that we're asking for action is actually 2.7.1, which is that.
And that was added today.
Yeah,
correct?
that was as
the
of today,
amendment,
yeah. Mr. Goss had asked if we could, if the committee of the whole would move that amendment forward as part of the development agreement.
Are there any specific questions related to 2.7.1, the first amendment, the development
I
agreement?
really have to clarify something.
I'm sorry, this is not a public hearing.
Mr. Costa is not telling you the truth on this, and I would like to ask the
I'll
question.
move approval of
our city
2.7.1.
council.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Who
Mr.
was
Weber.
involved in this for the 2 years before I even hear that Mr. Bean finds out the end of last year? Who are the people that are sitting up here that were involved in this project before that time, for the 2 years before it became public? You, Mr. Gosted, and Mr. Bochansky. Am I wrong? Does anybody really know what these
For the record,
documents say? I would like to
for the record, if I could answer the question.
Let her talk. Maybe you should let her finish before you let her talk.
The answer is, city administrative staff worked with the Grand Forks Region EDC, and we worked with the state of North
You've been hiding
Dakota.
this for a long time. We're sick of it.
That's the
Let her
update.
talk.
I would move to item
Is there a second?
7.1.
There's a motion, is there a second on
I would
7.1?
like to please ask that I would like to request a stay
Sorry.
on any matters dealing with Fufang until such
So,
time.
Ms.
that
Carlson, you're not on the
is
agenda
able to
tonight.
properly review and investigate and adjudicate the transactions. If we do not provide for a stay, if we continue to vote on moving things forward, the city will endure more costs.
Which
and
are covered by the-
Should the transaction be reversed by CFIUS. And I would beg you, Mr. Weber,
They're covered.
ladies, Mr. Bean, I have information right here that can invalidate what he's telling you. And I would like to share that with you because I think that you need it.
This is not a public hearing.
And the people deserve it.
This is not a public hearing. If you would like to come back
I
next,
don't care if it's a public hearing.
I understand.
If you're being lied to, and you can stand up there that you're Mr. Chinese and aerospace guy, I think people need to know the truth.
I think people need to know the truth as well, which is why we're here every Monday night.
And
Which
you're
is why
not
we're in
getting
the
it.
meeting.
If you want the truth, let me speak up then.
In fact, I'll say again, Mr. Sandy, if I may, President Sandy, Mr. Gaustad, I appreciate the work that's gone into this amended agreement. I think it does a fantastic job of protecting the city from the types of concerns that have been raised and that we, as council members, have raised, and I'll move approval of the amended development agreement.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Do not do this, guys.
Is there a second?
Do not.
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Weigel. There's a motion and a second. Any more additional comments on item 2.7.1? Mr. Veen?
Mr. Sandy, I was in part going back to 2.7. Can we talk about that? I think that was mostly information, right?
It's information only. Certainly, you're welcome to speak to 2.7.
So could I'd like to ask a couple questions.
Absolutely.
Mr. Goss said, I think we got in our packets today, or this week, the revised development agreement, right? I was maybe a little confused, because the original development agreement was like 45 pages, and when I printed this out, it was like 150 pages. And I think it included that matrix that you probably had at the end too, is that right? And how has it progressed? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Council Councilmember Veen and council members, there's been no change in the development agreement other than that what's been proposed. The length of it might be because there's the exhibits that were attached.
That's a change.
All those exhibits were contained in the development agreement as originally drafted.
They were all
Signed.
originally part of our agendas, the previous agendas, when we went in detail about the development agreement.
Okay.
All the exhibits were there.
And that's the clarity. Those exhibits haven't changed. Everything is specifically, the one thing you have added is that summary that of your management tool, or whatever you call it, has been added as, well, as like I said, a tool, but the rest of it, you're telling me, is all the same.
Correct.
Mr. Bean, you're not telling me the truth, I'm sorry.
Do you have further questions on 2.7 or 2.7.1, Mr. Veen?
I'm going to motion to table it because it just
I'm
got...
sorry, there's a
Oh, we
motion and a
can't do that?
second on the floor already. Thank you, Ms.
Good,
Osowski.
new information has come to light.
So there's a motion and a second on the floor. Are there any, you have to act on a motion that's already on the floor, and then, yeah, no problem. Yes, certainly, no problem. No problem at all.
So give the new girl a little grace.
I thought I was. So there's a motion and a second on the floor to move approval of item 2.71. Any other comments related to 2.71? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Ms. Osowski, motion passes. Ms. Osowski dissents. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Phelan. And 2.8, and then we're going to have...
Yeah, Mr. Gaddy's going to come up here, and you may want to dim the lights. We do have a presentation on this one.
Good. All right. Thank you, President Sandy, members of the committee. I'm just going to give some brief introductory comments here. I think much of what much of what Todd laid out as far as all of these agenda items, how they fit together, I think he did a good job. We do have, I will say, Mr. Paul Boersma from Black and Veatch on the phone. We have Mr. Adam Marcos from Black and Veatch on the phone. Todd, I don't know if you mentioned Mr. Shower from Mead and Hunt is also online here to assist with the presentation. But our presentation today, primarily want to cover four things. Specifically, myself and Black and Veatch will cover the first three here. And then, as Todd mentioned, the traffic impacts is actually item 2.9 on the agenda, because there is that request of the committee to receive and file the traffic study to progress into the MOU. The topics we're going to mention here around the MOUs and what they will contain is relevant to that. So why it's listed here in 2.8, but then will be acted on in item 2.9. There are a handful of MOU topics, and as Mr. Gosted talked through all of the various items that are included to the checklist, within that checklist specifically, there is Exhibit 323, which is a lot of the technical information that we have requested from Fufang, that ourselves, Black and Veatch, have been working to ultimately, request, receive, review, provide various evaluations. We're at all different stages of those evaluations across all of these items you have listed here today. The green, as we mentioned, is the red is what was on the prior slide that we intend to cover. The green is what we've made some decent progress on. We'll be coming back to committee and council in future meetings to review. So, like I said, a lot of topics here that fit the various categories that were in that Exhibit 323 within the development agreement, and we'll walk through the four that I mentioned here. As far as the MOUs, the development agreement, that exhibit that I referenced went so far as to ask for all of this information, that we're going to need all of this to ultimately get to the point of making determinations on what the plans are. The MOUs are essentially that next step to ultimately implement the conditions and requirements of the agreement, to say we have reviewed it, we agree with the plan or plans you're proposing, or the best management practices that you're proposing, and it's a way to document that and say this was our expectation. In addition to that, there's items that will be in these MOUs that'll say, well, what if things differ? And so, under item 6 here, it's the contingency plans. If things don't operate as were intended, either conditions vary with the site, with the project, et cetera, what will the plan be to address that, and what will remedies be should things vary from that? So taking the development agreement from just that, the development stage, into the implementation stage and what's going to be expected of the project. I'm going to hand things off here to Mr. Boersma from Black & Veatch, as I mentioned, and he's going to walk through 3 of those 4 items, specifically the wastewater pretreatment evaluation, the thermal plumes review, and as I mentioned, Mr. Schauer from Mead & Hunt, who is the airport's consultant and who we have been working directly with in the review of some of those emissions type of circumstances that have the potential to affect the airport. Mr. Schauer and Mr. Riesinger from the Airport Authority we've been in those detailed conversations, like I mentioned, with them, reviewing that information. Mr. Boersma will cover that. Tom is here, Mr. Schauer is here to answer any questions. And then lastly, as I mentioned, we're going to give a little update on where we're at within looking at all the various potential odor emissions of the plant. So with that, Paul, I'm going to hand it off to you, and I'll do my best to keep up with the slides as you go through here.
All right. Thank you, Sean, and thank you for this opportunity to do a fairly brief presentation on 3 different topics. We hope this is part of an ongoing series of presentations that help just explain, perhaps demystify some of the different processes and things we've been talking about, and give everybody a more clear understanding of what these MOUs will eventually look like. So what we are starting with our wastewater pretreatment MOU, and Sean, you can go to the next slide, please, is we start with a objective of what is the expectations of a particular area. In other words, what will success look like at the end of the day in terms of community expectations being met for a particular area. So we have attempted with each of these 3 areas to set out really kind of an objective statement. And the objective for wastewater treatment is to reliably and cost effectively meet Grand Forks pretreatment regulations with minimal nuisance odors and a well-managed biosolids management plan. That's really kind of what we are trying to achieve. Sean, if you can go to the next slide. The way we have done the analyses is fairly straightforward. We were provided by Fu Feng a variety of what their wastewater characteristics would look like. That is shown in the middle column. And we also have a fairly clear set of Grand Forks pretreatment requirements set by your own pretreatment standards. And effectively the task that we had as part of your consultant team is to evaluate, do we think the proposed wastewater pretreatment system will meet these pretreatment requirements. Sean, if you can go to the next slide. Fu Feng has provided a pretreatment process flow diagram. It's on the right. I realize it's a bit small. We are not going to go through it, but I think it's important for this group to understand that what they are providing is a fairly conventional, and this is the text on the right, a fairly conventional industrial biological treatment system. It has aeration tanks, clarifiers, fairly conventional, standard, well understood wastewater treatment processes, and some of those processes will generate biosolids, and those biosolids will either be land applied, which is common for wastewater treatment plants, or landfilled within your own municipal landfill. So that's effectively the process that they are proposing. Sean, next slide.
President Sandy, if I may, are we needing to wait for questions till the very end, or can we ask questions as we go? What's your preference?
I was hoping to take a break after each one of the 3 presentations or 3 segments, and then single back and ask questions.
Excellent, thank you.
So we went through, and effectively our process, or what we went through to evaluate this, is we construct our own wastewater treatment process model to basically predict or model what their system could achieve based on the sizings that they gave us, the types of reactors that they had. So I think we did some reasonable due diligence to provide an independent verification of the robustness, if you will, of their treatment plant. And I think we came to really three conclusions. There's more detail that we have just, but I think three high-level conclusions are as what follows. Fang is proposing a common and accepted method for pretreatment of wastewater with the expected characteristics, so we agree with their pretreatment approach. Second conclusion, the size of the main treatment processes is adequate to achieve the goals and objectives of the treatment process, so that they, we believe that they have not only chosen the right process, they have adequately sized the process. And our third goal, or our third observation, is that cover should be considered over certain processes. This discussion is ongoing with Fang. The reason for covers really would be to deal with odors, and in some processes there may be more of a need for covers than others, but as I said, this discussion is ongoing with Fang. But those are the essence of our three conclusions for what we have reviewed to date of what's been provided us. We'll just have one more slide on this topic. Sean, if you go to the next one. So clearly what we have seen right now is a very preliminary design. We will expect to be getting a much more detailed design that we can review. And as part of that detailed design, we would expect to receive what are termed standard operating procedures. And these will be used to address potential process upsets, loss of power, temperature management of different products that they produce, and really just flexibility in operations. So the bottom line is we feel like there's a good core process they are providing. We are anticipating seeing more detail that will help us evaluate the robustness and kind of the contingency planning around that process. So I'll take a break and see if there's any questions at this point.
Mr. Weber, questions?
Thanks. I'll go backwards if that's all right. I'll start with slide 10. Mr. Gaustad, this contingency plan that's being proposed, I mean, it isn't really a contingency plan, it's just a statement at this point. These are the kinds of issues, potential process upsets, loss of power, temperature management, flexibility in operations, et cetera. These are the types of contingencies that would be codified in the service contract agreement?
That's correct, and I know they mentioned the MOUs. I think some of these are probably it may be one and the same with respect to the utility service contract, so that there are these expectations, and then there's, remedies, provisions within those agreements, whether you call it an MOU or the utility service contract.
Very good. And then slide number 9, consultant team, overall comments. With the exception of, possible exception of Mr. Vian, as council members, I don't believe that we have the expertise to know any of this. This is why we hire consultants, bring in experts. So I think we're just left to trust that is regarding comments such as accepted method for pretreatment. We don't have that expertise, but that's why we hire, and we have respected, legitimate consultants on this. So I'm inclined to go along with accepting the statements on slide 9. Mr. Phelan or Mr. Getty, any comments on that?
Does this include the rusted stuff that came in from California?
Or Mr. Vian, do you have any comments on that?
I would say, Councilmember Weber, Black and Beach will come back as we get more and more information. All that information will enter into an agreement, whether it's we call it a utility agreement or MOU. And we also have in the wastewater's case, we have an industrial pretreatment permit that they need to satisfy, and that's regulated by the state of North Dakota and of course the EPA. So again, there's going to be plenty of checks and balances as we move forward.
Very good.
I have a comment.
And then I'll go back to slide 8. Frankly, I mean, I can't really, I guess I could take a magnifying glass and a great deal of time and try to understand this, but I don't think I'm supposed to be able to understand all of the steps in this process flow diagram.
You don't understand anything.
Again, I'm looking to the consultants. Is there anything that I should know specifically about this, Mr. Gaddy?
Sorry, Mr. Member. Mr. Weber, I guess, maybe I'll start, and if you want to fill in the blanks.
Okay.
I guess what I would say is this process flow diagram is just meant to demonstrate that we're asking for pretty detailed information from them, and they're providing it.
Very good. Very good.
So, there's a lot of background flows, loadings, blower sizing, recirculation rates, all of the different things that go into making this work.
Yes.
They're giving us that information. So they're in the preliminary design process. We will also get to see their final designs as well.
Right, because this is just a preliminary design process. There will be a final design process, and then there'll be the actual construction, and at each of those steps, we'll be monitoring that.
Correct, we'll get a chance to see that.
Excellent. Yes. And then slide 7, I think that we are capable of understanding the basic information here, but I'm asking if you'd take a moment and walk me through this table. So I understand that we can anticipate a maximum of 1.8 million gallons per day of flow of pre-treated wastewater. Is that correct?
So yes, they've given us a few different flow values related to the different areas of the process. For actual process wastewater, it's going to be 1.8 million gallons per day.
Okay.
There is additional water pretreatment residuals that will also be blended to this. So their total flow on average that will be discharged to the city will be 2.6 million gallons per day. But for the wastewater that is actually of high strength that's being utilized in their process overall, that they will be pretreating, this value, it is slightly different than we've shown before. I just wanted to point that out.
Could I stop you there for just a second? Because at 4:30 we had a meeting regarding the interconnect with East Grand Forks. And one of the things that was discussed at that time is that we already have a similar agreement in terms of volume, in terms of flow, the quantitative aspect. And we have a tried and tested agreement that has been in effect. We have customers on the other side of the river. We accept their wastewater, and I believe the average that we can accept up to 1.2 million gallons a day. So this isn't just stuff that we have no experience with. We've actually been doing something, at least in terms of volume, very similar to what we're looking at here.
With East Grand Forks, correct, yes. You have both an agreement and an industrial pretreatment permit with East Grand Forks. Similarly, you have industrial pretreatment permits that city staff has been doing very well to administer with entities like J.R. Simplot for decades.
Yes, for decades.
Yeah, so it's something that staff is very familiar with working through.
Yes, and I have to confess, as a council member, even though I've often been asked to make decisions about that, I've not understood every single technical aspect of that. It's why we depend on consultants and staff to do that detailed work. And it's been an essential step in being able to host important industrial partners in our community, such as Simplot, et cetera. So that has to do with the amount of flow. Would you walk me through the details then of the quality of what we would be anticipating?
So there's some parameters we don't have all the final detail from them on, but the ones that when we're looking at the sizing of a pretreatment facility like this, that is most important, I would say, is your biochemical oxygen demand, that BOD, and then your TKN, which is your nutrients or nitrogen loading to the facility. Both of those create primarily the aeration demand that they're going to have to pre-treat that raw wastewater down to the strengths that we're showing as your requirement on the right-hand side. So when we're saying we've reviewed the systems and determined that they have the appropriate redundancy, they've been sized correctly, they've been sized to take these middle values that have an oxygen demand to them and bring them down to the requirements of the permit levels. Some of these things you're not really modeling at this point. For instance, H2S, things like that become more of an operational issue. So there's things that are in the permit that you're not going to model from a strength standpoint up front. but that you're going to have within the permit to monitor to make sure that they are staying within the parameters. So another reason why you're seeing some blanks down the middle of this, and then with the requirement on the right-hand side that ultimately becomes more operational in its consideration.
Very good, thank you. And I've heard complaints or concerns that why didn't we know all of this before we made any agreement to start working with the program developers, the project developers. But of course, they don't know all the answers to this either. We're developing this all in concert with one another and going through a design phase to see what's going to be required. And all of these requirements from the city for pretreatment certainly are well within the bounds of state and federal guidelines. We're not doing anything that in some cases even meets those. Ours are more restrictive than the state and federal in some cases?
Correct. Your pretreatment program has to, at a minimum, meet the federal requirements, and then there are what are called local limits to those federal requirements that at least have to be federal standard or more restrictive.
Very good. This is really helpful. And with all of that said, I feel much better about slides 7 through 10 with one issue, and I'll go back to slide 9. One of the things that I remember learning from our field trip, slide 9 was the, let's go down, those were the...
This one? I don't have slide numbers,
the evaluation. And I'm looking at that final comment about covers. One of the things when we went to Nebraska and Iowa to look at the corn milling plants there, one of the problems that we saw was a pretreatment facility that did not have covers, and it seemed that that's where the odor was coming from, at least according to the city officials that we visited with. So I understood that we were going to be insisting upon covers. Are covers necessary or not? I realize this is an ongoing conversation with Fufeng, but can you talk to me about the covers over the plant would have lagoons. We're hoping that they will be covered. They're suggesting that that's not necessary. Would you or the consultant discuss this issue of covers for a moment?
Paul, do you want me to start, or do you want to take first cut at that?
Sure, go ahead. I may have a couple more observations, but go ahead, Sean.
I would just say we're talking with them as far as where covers are appropriate. There are certain basins of the pretreatment process that I would say are where they don't have active airflow within the basins, and so covers aren't as technically challenging to implement versus basins where there is active airflow. Active airflow is good.
And active airflow, it's being agitated.
Big blowers, high horsepower blowers that are sending a lot of oxygen into the water. And whenever you cover a facility like that, you also have to find a way to vent a facility like that. And the way that they're proposing those active airflow basins to be constructed, structurally, there's some things that they're not quite sure they'll be able to do to be able to cover them appropriately. And so it's more of a technical review issue right now in understanding the configuration of some of those basins where they're trying to say, how would we do that? And working together with them. So I wouldn't say they've said absolutely not to covers at this point. I'd say we're working through the technicalities of that. And Paul, I don't know what you'd add to that.
I would also add with covers, there are really two issues. There's the engineering and just the practicality of covers, and they do provide more control of odors, but they also, there are operational challenges associated with them. But second, Fufeng is asking us to really review the robustness of their wastewater treatment plant, because what the challenge that a wastewater treatment plant would have is if it's undersized or not achieving the desired treatment, that's really when you start to get more odors emitted from the treatment plant. And they are asking us to evaluate with them, and this is part of the standard operating procedures or parameters that I discussed a few slides ago. They are asking us to evaluate with them the robustness of their treatment systems. So even if there would be a partial failure in one treatment train, there would still be enough capacity and robustness that effective treatment would be achieved without generating odors. And so instead of defaulting directly to the decision of saying we insist on having a cover over a particular process, we have agreed to evaluate with them as they provide more details how robust and redundant some of their equipment is. And we haven't seen those details yet, but we are moving forward in that discussion with Fufang in good faith.
Very good. So I hope that I'm not oversimplifying here, but what I believe I'm understanding at this point is that simply insisting on covers for cover's sake may not be necessary. Indeed, it could end up causing unintended problems regarding odor. Is that a fair statement?
I think that is a good summary, and we don't want to insist on covers for cover's sake and have them needlessly spend money that in hindsight doesn't really contribute to a solution. Perhaps we would rather have them spend that money in the robustness of their treatment system as opposed to a cover.
But this is an ongoing discussion, and we can anticipate hearing more about this issue about covers, yes?
Absolutely.
Thanks. That's all I have at this time on wastewater.
Thanks. Any other, Mr. Dean, questions about water pretreatment?
Yeah, a couple. I hope I can find them all in my notes here. I did like the answer that we just had. One of my concerns is if we tell them and design this for them, we will be held accountable. And if it doesn't work, it's our fault. What I see you guys doing is Fufang is going to do their own design, and what I see you doing is validating and looking at the robustness as a double check, but the responsibility still has to fall back on them. Is that right?
I would agree with that, Mr. P.
Yes.
So I think we got to be a bit careful, because I want to hold them accountable when we're all done for everything from design, construction. I guess I looked at startup, and then when we get into operations. Now, oftentimes, at least on the water treatment side, you'll do a plant scale modeling or bench scale modeling and plant scale modeling. Is there any modeling of this that will be done prior to construction?
We've developed an actual process model, a well-recognized computer process model. The challenge of a pilot, so I think you're talking like a pilot scale type of analysis, is you need to have the representative wastewater to be able to do that, and without a plant operating here with our water, with our water quality background conditions and their actual processes they intend to do, that would be pretty challenging. To a question just like that, when we visited the Blair facilities, and they talked about receiving representative wastewater samples from other facilities, et cetera, they stated that because of the background water quality issues, because of the actual agricultural inputs and other input products that they had that they were getting in this geography versus another, it became very unrepresentative of what actually happened in that situation. And so what we really want to make sure is we're looking at what's the background data of what they intend to do here. We're running it through those computerized process models to validate, like Mr. Boersma just mentioned, the robustness of that. And we'll continue to do that through the design process. But actually having like a drop of wastewater to be able to do that bench scale testing here would be very difficult because it's not being produced the same way.
They did, though, provide the expected concentration before pretreatment. Correct. So that information come from someplace, right?
It comes from, their overall intention of how they intend to operate here with this facility and the products they're fermenting and intending to make.
So, so there's some idea, they have plants, not just the one that's planned here, but in other locations that should give us some of those expected concentrations? Where did that come from?
We could ask for that, but there's concerns that they wouldn't be representative of what they did here. And like I said, when we talked to the Blair facility about that, or we talked to the folks in Blair, sorry, I mentioned that wrong, it was actually Fort Dodge, where we asked that question. They said the representatives, samples they got from other facilities, because all those background conditions weren't representative of what they actually ended up doing
Yeah, and that's why I was
Fort
looking
Dodge.
potentially at bench scale, plant scale, then you'd have a better idea. There was another thought that I had, but I lost it.
Mr. Vian, sorry, we could talk to some of our process modelers, of which Paul and I aren't the process modelers, to follow up on that question, but I was just giving you an indication as to what some of the challenges might be. So,
Is there a way to build the factor of safety in here?
the factor of safety for the most part is in the redundancy. And so the facility they have is independently, there's 2 trains of treatment that they're proposing. Just one of those trains could treat their raw wastewater characteristics by itself. The redundancy is they have 2 trains should they have any issue with one or the other in their operations.
Or if one isn't keeping up, can you run both?
You could, yes.
So that would appear to be a fairly significant factor of safety then.
Yes.
Yeah, and I don't know
That's
wastewater that
correct.
well, but I'm just trying to figure out, you know, we don't run short.
Yeah, I mean, redundancy and redundant systems is the key to the factor of safety in wastewater plant design. For instance, the city of Grand Forks' wastewater plant has 4 reactors currently for the load that it receives. And it's designed so that any one of those reactors that the city's facility has could go out of service at any time, and you'd still have the remainder capacity. So you have a 1-for-4 redundancy. They have a 1-for-1 in essence in this case.
Thank you, Mr. Bean. Any other questions about the pretreatment? Hearing none, moving on to the thermal plume.
Okay, so as we're moving to the next slide, it's kind of helpful for me to think about the following. Think of there's a certain envelope around the food fame facility, and what we are really primarily concerned with the community is what kind of comes out of that envelope in ways that could affect the community. So their wastewater is one such waste stream. We are now shifting our attention and thinking about quite a different thing, and this is a thermal plume. And let me just kind of explain a thermal plume a minute. So food fame will be having a gas turbine, not unlike a regular utility electric plant, but at a smaller scale, but at a fairly significant scale. They will still be burning a lot of natural gas, and that natural gas will be exhausted through a stack. In that stack, those emissions, that thermal plume, that heat, if you will go up in the air. And the question we are asking is, given the proximity of the site to the airport, and in this diagram we don't specifically say this, but the site is about 20,000 feet east of the airport. And the question we are asking is, will this thermal plume potentially impact any aviation operations? And so if we come back to our thermal plume performance expectation, the expectation is that the design and operations of the facility are such that the thermal plumes will not adversely impact aircraft. So intuitively, you think of being on an airplane that's in a very turbulent air conditions. That's what we are trying to avoid in this case. Sean, if we go to the next slide. So in this case, there are not hard and fast applicable regulations. There's no specific FAA regulation, but however, the city is responsible for compatible land use around an airport. So the FAA does not get too directive in terms of saying you can do this, you cannot do that. But the second bullet on here is that the FAA in a review capacity could evaluate potential hazards near airports, and it could issue some type of hazard determination. And by the way, the language on this slide, in the subsequent evaluations were done very closely with Tom Schroyer. As Mr. Phelan had said, Tom emailed that he was not available for this call, but we have had extensive conversations with Tom in his aviation expertise as part of the development of these slides. So third bullet on here is to desire to ensure that airport operations are not negatively impacted. We want to make sure we don't inadvertently put the airport or FAA in a challenging position with a thermal plume. And Tom had advised us on this last bullet that when you think about a plane coming in at 20,000 feet away from the runway, it would typically be at an elevation of 1,000 feet. That's what it should be at. Realizing there could be some variation in there, a plane should not be any lower than 617 feet above ground surface for a low approach. So this is kind of the elevation that we are evaluating for a plane approaching the airport from the east. We can go to the next slide, please. This is a little bit of engineering detail, but with their on the left-hand column on here is what they will normally operate their stack discharge at. The bottom bullet on here is 250 degrees Fahrenheit. They will normally be at that temperature, but if they are not doing some heat recovery out of that thermal plume, they can be as high as 650 degrees Fahrenheit in their discharge. So this is the information that we evaluated. If we can go to the next slide, please. We used, and Adam Marcos is on this call, and he helped us do this. We used a model, it's called the MITRE model. It may not be that important, but it's a model used for such applications. It is accepted and recognized by the FAA. And effectively what this model is doing is it's looking at a thermal plume, and what it's modeling is the probability that either some type of a turbulence could be encountered by a plane, either a turbulence or just an upset in the flight path because of the thermal plume. And remember, with any group of aviation, probabilities, acceptable probabilities of things that aren't desired are very, very low. So in this case, we've just shown you kind of an example model output on the right-hand side. But this outer yellow band that we show on this thermal plume is really a 1 in 10 million chance of severe turbulence. So the FAA looks at very low probabilities, 1 in a million, 1 in 10 million, and these are the types of probabilities we are evaluating in this kind of analysis. One more slide here, and I ask for your patience as we're almost through this topic. But when you consider an aircraft approaching the airport, not only do you consider its height, not only do you consider the thermal plume, but you consider the type of the aircraft. And so what's on the top couple pictures is just standard commercial aircraft that we all fly in, that we're familiar with. Bottom right is business jet. A little bit smaller. Bottom middle is light general aircraft. These are Cessnas. These are the kinds of planes used by UND in their aviation training program. And then in the bottom left, these are light sport aircraft. These are extremely small, one-seater little planes that people fly really just as kind of hobby planes. In the essence of this slide is what it's showing is that For commercial aircraft, there is really, at the elevations that we're talking about, 1,000 feet, between 1,000 and 617 feet, there is no adverse impact of any probability on commercial aircraft. The same is true as we move to the lower right. There's no adverse impact of any scenario for business jets. In the lower middle graphic, it's the same thing. There's no adverse impact for light general aircraft. For the worst case scenario, you can see where the yellow line is just below our 617 foot kind of predicted elevation. And then for the final scenario, light sport aircraft, again, these think of more hobby kind of aircraft. If a very light sport aircraft were flying over this thermal plume under its worst conditions, there could be some measurable probability of a upset or turbulence by that aircraft. And so that is a factor that may have to be considered. If we go to the next slide. So here's our overall conclusions with a thermal plume. There is not an adverse impact for light general aviation planes, the type used by UND for training, or commercial aircraft under any scenario. This is not even, second bullet, this is not even in the area of flight paths used by UND for training. Third bullet is there's a very slight impact for these very light sport aircraft. But light sport aircraft make up a very, very small percentage of air traffic. And if, as for FANG is built, last slide, you can go to one more slide here. We would need to work with the airport for appropriate procedures, which may need notifying these extremely light sport aircraft pilots of potential airspace, staying out of the area around FANG if there's an upset in there and they're not doing thermal recovery from their plume. So I realize I kind of said a mouthful, but we're trying just to kind of sketch out for you. There's a lot of discussions with aviation, and we're trying to summarize aviation issues associated with food train, because aviation is very important, obviously, in Grand Forks. I'll pause here for questions.
What about the steam plume?
Questions? Yes, Mr.
Yes,
Weber?
Mr. President Sandy. I found this to be very useful, very easy to understand. In fact, while there have been dark conspiracy theories about your connection to China, President Sandy, you actually do have a small conflict, not of interest, but a conflict with this project because of the need for us to make, you and I both, we want to see a healthy UND. Slide 15 seemed to take care of my concerns about that. I'm curious about your response to
Actually,
slide 15.
Mr. Cadillac and I share the same concern regarding the visual plume, and so I'm wondering what sort of work was done related to the visual plume.
Paul, I could take that if you'd like me to start.
Please do. Yep.
So we will be reviewing the visual plumes, and primarily, so the thermal plumes come from things like these stacks that Paul described for their gas-powered turbine generation. The visual plumes are more so from a cooling tower perspective, and they are still working through some of their design details on what will actually be flow rates, cooling rates, et cetera, with those cooling towers. So we just don't have all the information to get through that yet. So we wanted to share, we're pretty well along in this. We've had some good meetings with the airport. The airport asked the exact same question of us, is please work with us when you have the information available on those visual plumes. And like I said, that's just still in process.
Oh, good.
That's great.
This is going to be a long, long process. All of these are detailed, complex issues, and we're going to be hearing information, receiving data and reports for some time. But tonight, we were mainly getting information about the turbulence. What sort of pre-notice would there be for a severe turbulence event, a 1 in a 10 million event? Is this something that we would know about minutes before, hours before?
As I understand it, Fufang would know when they've gone into that condition where their heat recovery system essentially goes down. And,
Right.
and as I understand it, that will only happen, if that were to happen, it would be for hours, it wouldn't be a continuous operation mode. So if that happened, the notification requirement would be to let the airport know it's happened in order for them to issue a notification to pilots.
Great, thanks. Thanks, I have no more questions about this section.
Any other questions? Mr. Veen?
Well, I think we're probably aligned with this one, because I was worried about the visual plume too, for what that means, how high it'll be, how far away we'll be able to see it. Will it mark the city by the plume or not? And then also, what's in the plume? You know, what goes up, if there's whatever emissions are going to come back down, where does that go?
So the emissions of the plume are what actually will get studied within their air permit, which I understand we're about 4 weeks out from submittal to the state. So, in this case, it's combustion that is it's combustion of natural gas in this instance. So
Is it, that's all that's in the plume?
in this plume here, correct. There are other plumes throughout the facility. This is the most significant that we reviewed. The air permitting process that will go through North Dakota DEQ, that will all be reviewed, and they'll do certain dispersion modeling, et cetera, in order to review that. They're not ready to submit that with their consultant yet to DEQ, and so we don't have that information yet either. It's in development.
And any idea timeline for that?
I think they said last week 4 weeks is about what they were expecting.
4 weeks?
To make that submittal to the state, yes.
It's interesting to note that this visual plume and the thermal plume on this plant is significantly small compared to a Northern Plains nitrogen, both visual and thermal plume. So going through this process today is good for us to learn about them so that we can be better prepared if and when NPN does their fundraising.
Have you done a field trip to look at the rusted equipment?
Go on
I
to-
would also say, Mr. Sandy, related to the visual plumes, their geographic location
Yes,
here
exactly,
is
and the location, that's
far
correct.
better relative to aviation considerations versus what we've talked about in prior projects.
Great. Can we move on to the odor study, please? Thank you.
Go ahead, Paul, sorry.
So now think about our third think about this envelope over the plant, and then the third thing is odor control expectations. And here's kind of our objectives. The plant operates continuously with minimal odors in adjacent industrial areas and residential areas. So let's do a little bit of education on where odors come from with a wet corn mill. They will come from VOCs, volatile organic compounds, things that evaporate easily into the air, and so you smell, as well as sulfur-containing compounds. Those are effectively the two sources of odors. And it's also, I'm going to build on what Mr. Beatty just said here. Odors relate to, but it's separate from regulated air emissions. And so a lot of their air pollution control equipment, which is going to be required by the state, will in effect be addressing odors at the same time. But nevertheless, the state is primarily in the business of regulating things from a human health perspective. So odor is related to regulated air emissions, but it's a little bit distinct at the same time. Let's go to the next slide. But there are state regulations that apply. So with the air emissions, there's extensive federal and state regulations. But with odor, specifically, the following more qualitative regulation applies. This is directly from state statutes in North Dakota. A person may not discharge into the ambient air any objectionable odorous air containment contaminant that measures 7 odor concentrations. We can explain that a little bit more. Units or higher outside the property boundary where the discharge is occurring. So when you move into the world of odor, unlike, like say wastewater or air emissions where you're talking about concentrations parts per million, really what you're dealing here is how many times does it take to dilute a sample to the point where you can no longer smell it. And obviously, some things take a lot of dilution because they're fairly smelly materials, and other things take fewer dilutions. But that is, in effect, the state regulation. So there are state regulations that apply. It's important to note that in the second paragraph, there's no local ordinances specifically to odor, but there are ordinances that still speak to odor, especially with wastewater discharge and hazardous waste. And there's just general nuisance provisions in the municipal code for Grand Forks. And it's also important to note in the third paragraph here that the Grand Forks Department of Health has people and instruments. Yes, there's a thing called the centometer that are qualified for odor monitoring, and if unacceptable odors are detected, there are mechanisms by which your local health Department of Health will work with the state regulators to enforce these regulations. So that's a bit of a regulatory context. Let's go to the next slide. There's a lot of things on this slide. Again, we appreciate you providing this graphic. I'm going to just basically summarize the left-hand column on here. And then when you think of what happens at a wet corn mill, it's effectively this. There's raw material, there's corn that comes in, it's stored. The storage of that corn potentially is a source of odors. And next, that corn goes through a steeping process. That's effectively where it's soaked in sometimes a dilute acid, like a sulfuric acid, to help break it down. That can also generate odors. There's a fermentation process to start to make the ultimate products that you want. Then there's a material processing or drying process, and then there's a wastewater treatment process. So there's really 5 different steps in the wet corn mill process. Each of them have their own unique potential for odor emissions. Let's go to the next slide. We have gone through with FANG, and we have process engineers within Black and Beach who have been fairly involved in the air permitting and design of wet corn mills, and effectively with this first step of material receiving and storage, we concur with their recommendations of how they're going to deal with odors from material receiving and storage. I won't go through the details of these processes. The second step, steeping, the corn being soaked in dilute sulfuric acid. We likewise concur with the recommendations that they are making. I feel that they are using state-of-the-art technology for odor control in this step of the process. If we can go to the next slide, please. The fermentation process. Likewise, we concur and understand the technologies that they are going to be using to control odor. On the dryers, they are proposing a newer technology. We understand why they are proposing it, but it is a fairly new technology, and effectively we are asking them for more details, more justification, and some more data to kind of back up so we have a better sense of how this particular technology will work with the dryers. It's not that we are disbelieving that it's going to work, but because of the newness of the technology, at least within the North American market, and I think it may have had more application in overseas markets, we would just like to see more detail on it. And then if we can go to the next slide, please. With wastewater, we've already had a previous discussion with odor control and the potential for whether we cover unit processes or not. Sean, if you can go to the final slide. So the air permit will be submitted in August, as was noted. We will see a lot more detail in August. In general, our observation or conclusion is that Fufang is proposing appropriate technology for what has been reviewed. Similar to our wastewater observations, we want to see more of the details of that technology, have a discussion with them on the robustness of the equipment, the sizing of the equipment. But in terms of is the technology selection at this point, from what we have seen, directionally correct and appropriate for the application, we are saying that it is. And I think we have one more slide and then we're done.
I think sorry.
That's it. Okay. So I will pause here, and again, I move through this quickly. It's a very important discussion. See if there's any more questions we can answer.
Any questions related to the, yeah, Mr. Veen?
But Paul.
Do these gentlemen know where the equipment is coming from? Do they know what it looks like?
Paul, I was
purchasing new equipment.
Excuse us for interrupting, Cam, please. We don't mean to interrupt, but this is such a farce. We've seen the equipment, this state-of-the-art robust equipment. Have you seen it, sir? It's disgusting. It came from California, that a plant got shut down over 12 years ago. It looks like rust that should be hauled to the scrap metal. You need to wake up, City Council. It is outdated equipment. It is not Mr. Sandy, don't smirk again like you are.
Who's smirking?
I don't mean to be...
I'm trying to manage a meeting. You've taken over. What would you like me to do?
Okay, if we wait until it's all over, it doesn't make any sense of how it applies to what you're talking about. I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt.
So,
we have
can I ask a question?
Let me finish, please. I'm sorry, let me finish. I have seen the equipment. It's out by where my shop is. It comes in every day on trucks. It is junk. And he's trying to sell it as this robust state-of-the-art. It's not true. I'm sorry. You have to open your eyes, people. Do you want to see the pictures right now?
Mr. Spicer, thank you.
Pictures,
I appreciate it. Can we address your issue?
Thank you for listening.
Can we address your issue? Mr. Phelan?
Sure.
Can you address the issue, please?
Sure, I sure will. We are aware that they have brought in equipment in to the site. I think it's important to know, as part of the development agreement, is that we have an inspections department. We also have procured the services of Black & Veatch, and so that when we go through the various building plans, checking out all the various equipment, all of that equipment will have to be signed off on. So whether a company brings something to town with intentions to use it for whatever reason, just so that U.S. City Council and the public knows, all of that equipment will be reviewed, approved, as part of the development agreement.
So why did Tudor say in the Grand Herald,
Mr. Phelan.
we have the newest, most highly technological corn milling plant within the nation? That's the exact quote. That's an exact quote. You guys can't lie anymore. It's pre-contaminated.
I think, Council President Sandy, that's the conclusion of our overview, and obviously more details will come. And if anyone has some input as we bring this forward, we probably bring it forward similar to the next item, which is the traffic study that we'd like you to have further.
Mr. Veen,
Could I just add one quick comment? I appreciate the presentation. You talked about the technology, and there's some work to do there. The equipment is an issue that we've heard that we want to make sure is appropriate. Probably the biggest concern that I have is operations, because you can have the best equipment and the best technology. If it isn't operated properly, you can have issues with odor. And so how do we address to make sure that it's operated appropriately? And if it's not, what controls do we have to remedy it?
Paul, do you want to address that first?
I will. Mr. Ian, that's a very good observation, and I think we could have added onto our slides the standard operating procedures that we will be asking for on the wastewater treatment equipment. We will be asking for similar standard operating procedures, contingency planning, and so forth on the operations of their air pollution control equipment. So absolutely, we concur with your statement that operations are essential, and we will be asking for this information. Bear in mind, we are still at a very preliminary part of the design review because they're in the preliminary part of their design at this point.
And thank you, I appreciate that. I mean, the contingency planning is good, and if there is an issue, what is the recourse we have? Because we know what's happened in other facilities where we've had a lot of odor. How can we proactively address this and get something shut down if in fact there is? Just making sure we have that process established, I think will be very important.
Thank you, Mr. Veen. Thank you, Mr. Gaddy. Mr. Grasser, item 2.9, traffic study report for 8477 Fufeng traffic study.
Good evening, Council President Sandy, members of the committee. The wet corn milling facility, we all know, is going to generate vehicle traffic, truck traffic, train traffic as they deliver and export their products. To identify some of those impacts of that traffic, the city did hire a traffic engineer. We did hire the firm of Bolton and Mink to do the traffic study. They've been working with information provided by Fufeng relative to the amount of trucks and vehicles, et cetera, that are coming in. Leading the team is Mike Bittner. He is online with us tonight. Mike's got quite a bit of extensive experience in the city of Grand Forks and a lot of traffic work for us. So he's going to review kind of what he's come up with the study, some of the review that he's done with the North Dakota DOT, and some of the recommended system improvements that are a result of that study. So with that, I will introduce Mr. Mike Bittner.
Thanks for being here tonight.
Thanks for having me, President Sandy, members of the council. Can everybody see my screen and hear my voice okay?
Yep.
Wonderful. So to talk to the traffic impact assessment, I want to start by saying that we've been working on this since the start of the year. We've completed our cursory analysis several months ago, but have been working with DOT to try to get an understanding of how we move forward with some of these transportation improvements and what that looks like for a funding aspect. But really where we started was, what's the overall vision? If a facility like this comes into place, what are the standards in which we want to operate? And so our you see the words on the screen here, but really the vision is that we want the transportation system to operate as effectively as it does today with and without the plant. And that sometimes means that we need to have new turn lanes, new traffic control, new roadway sections, whatever that means to be able to accommodate that traffic. We also want to make sure we have some standard expectations for how trucks will operate and move through that area, and how that they will interact with our, the publicly owned right-of-way and the roadways there. And one unique aspect about this site is it does have a great deal of truck parking and other parking compared to other similar sites. So the information we requested and received from Fufeng was related to the traffic generation. How much are you expected to bring in? How much are you expected to generate? How does that distribute between trucks and cars and freight, whether that be trains? How many people work there? So that way we can get a better understanding of exactly what those transportation impacts could possibly be. So this is a bar chart and a couple bullets on what that traffic generation is expected to look like. Looks like it's lagging a little bit on your end of the screen here, but so you can kind of see how this compares overall to different sites. We have about 200 to 300 trucks per weekday and 400 to 580 vehicular trips per weekday, and that is related to staffing to and from the facility. We also have 30 new rail cars, not trains, rail cars, so components of an individual train that and that would come upon existing train movements that are already going to be on that line today. And so as we compare these traffic projections, you can see at the bottom we've got our spoofing sites. We have the cars and the trucks, cars in blue, trucks in orange here, and then we just kind of compared it to a couple of different sites. The last time I gave a similar presentation a couple months ago, one of the questions I received was, well, it's hard to know exactly what 200 to 300 cars or trucks means and feels like. So could you compare that to something similar? And so we generated this graphic. You can see US 2 today as it stands without the Fufang site generates exponentially more traffic. It's pretty logical. You're drawing from lots of different areas, but even truck stops or Walmarts really do generate a lot more traffic. Overall, really industrial sites, heavy industrial sites, this is common, and these trip generation rates are pretty normal within the grand scheme of just heavy manufacturing sites. It is a lot more production than it is overall traffic generation due to the number of people that work there and whatnot. So the way we assessed the improvement needs was we did look at regional core yield generation to understand where traffic could be coming from and how long it take to get here to understand when it could occur, freight distribution and logistic chains that we already have through our system. We looked at local employment to understand where the workers would come to and from this site. Now we put this information into a traffic model, which then helps us understand that, okay, this turning movement's going to be a little delayed, there's going to be queues at this location. We also looked at railroad crossing, specifically on US 2 to understand how those extra rail cars would impact traffic flow. And then we can compare this to 3 other sites to make sure that some of the component inputs that we had were making sense and that they were realistic as we move through this process. So overall, the summary of impacts, you'll see on this graphic, is it's kind of a map with arrow callouts of specific improvements that would be necessary to support the distribution plan. And so we've got, overall, the impacts are a bit modest when you think about the grand scale of how many acreage that would be built in this area. Overall, it's about less than 50 vehicles for any of the worst movements. And that does factor in this idea that we are going to distribute it through a lot of different directions. If you're coming from the north versus the west versus the south versus the east, there are different routes you might take to get to this location. One important aspect is as we look at facilities like this, traffic is distributed pretty evenly throughout the day. If anything, a lot of times some of the peak truck periods are actually off-peak periods for our normal traffic, and that's often intentional. Trucks struggle to get through congestion and time is money as you start to move through your logistical supply chain. We didn't have any new traffic control devices. I know a question was raised in the past of what about Washington, US 81 and 27th Street as a location that would need some traffic control. That location does need some turn lanes, but the DOT, Department of Transportation, does have very explicit requirements for new traffic control devices, because they've just had a lot of studies and experience that show that when you put them in the wrong spots and always stop or a traffic signal, you actually increase crashes by disrupting driver expectancy and also just increasing conflict potential. And so this location, there's a minimum baseline requirement for anything. We don't meet, these need 0 to 8 hours based on our traffic generation to and from this site. And maybe that does change in the future as the land to the south starts to develop and provide additional traffic. But this time it's specific to this site, it wouldn't generate any of that. Additionally, as we look at the rail activity, it was 30 cars, kind of being lumped onto an existing train based on the proximity to US 2, being able to get mostly up to speed. We didn't see really a huge increase in overall delays from the rail standpoint. That's not to say that there's not delays today that should be considered for improvements, but specific to this site, it wasn't the basis in which you need to make a major rail grade crossing improvement on US 2. There were a number of necessary improvements, however, to support this site. The first of which is 27th Avenue. I'm going to use my zoom in here. And the improvement here would need to be a concrete roadway improvement, a 3-lane section / 2-lane section to the west of 39th based on available right-of-way. Really, the primary need here is structurally, just to be able to support those trucks, but also just some of those turning movements in and out would really benefit from a safety perspective by having that center turn lane. Another one of the high dollar improvements, that first one was about $3 million to improve 27th Avenue. At Washington and 27th, we'd also looked at a northbound left turn lane and the potential for a southbound, depending on what DOT wants to do, but based on their criteria, we would require a northbound left turn lane, and that would be about $400,000, and that would provide some safety improvements and traffic flows. We start to get those trucks and other vehicles off that roadway. And then the other high dollar improvements, about $150K would be a southbound right turn lane. You see on my north arrow is pointed to the right here. The southbound right turn lane, this is Highway 2 or Gateway, and this is 42nd Street. And this is from an operational perspective, just as we add more traffic up and down 42nd, which is our primary access route, is the closest proximity to I-29. We could start to see some queuing and blockages, and that frontage road already experiences some of that blockage today. So that improvement would help with the traffic flow. Then two other smaller scale improvements would be just extending left turn lanes. As we add more trucks to the traffic stream, we're not having massive increases in delays, but we are just needing more space. We have more trucks that just take more space. They've got slower startup and stop times, which is reflected within our models. And each of these improvements were between $63,000 to $66,000. So in total, it's just shy of $3.7 million worth of necessary improvements to be able to accommodate this site. So as you look at wrapping up the traffic study, the study report is completed. It has been reviewed by the DOT and approved by them. As I mentioned at the top, there's continued efforts with the state to understand the best ways to develop a funding plan. A lot of these improvements are on U.S. highways, which is really the purview of the DOT. It's understanding how those projects can move forward and, to prevent some of those delays and issues that we might experience prior to the opening day. And so the second item would then be requesting council action to receive and file this study. Should, I'd be able to answer all your questions if you have here in a second. And then from that point forward would be to translate that study into an MOU document. That way we can look at our performance expectations, which we started with, but also look at what some of those deviation contingency plan and remedy items could be, should this operate a little bit differently than what we expect. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Bittner. Mr. Grasser, something else to add for the good? No? Okay. Any questions for Mr. Bittner? Mr. Veen?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Let me start out. How did you distribute the traffic hourly? You said you distributed it evenly. Did you do it like through the 8 hours of the day, 12 hours, or 24 hours?
Yeah, so we actually tested a couple things with that specific distribution. Tried to talk to some of those similar sites to understand how they come in, and really their experience was often that it's pretty evenly distributed. It's hard to know exactly when. We've also heard that it's specifically very early in the morning to kind of unload some of that materials early in the day to beat some of the peak traffic. But we actually tried loading a lot of that into some of the peak hours to be extra conservative to make sure that our improvements were able to accommodate some of that daily variation, seasonal variation that we might see from a site like this. But we also tested it with more of an even distribution throughout kind of the normal operating days where they would be accepting corn in and then also generating, completed final product out.
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing all of that. I may have to ask separately later. I guess the turning movement that bothers me or that I'm most concerned about is traffic coming off of Interstate, probably northbound onto Gateway Drive, and we have longer train traffic delaying cars on Highway 2, especially during morning rush hours. The reason why I bring this up is probably several years back, Earl Haugen, who came in, complained that cars and traffic backs up at that point now. If you have longer trains and more traffic, especially truck traffic, my concern is that may expedite or require a need for a grade-separated crossing of Highway 2 and the railroad tracks, because the alternative is you back traffic up on interstate. Was that looked at, Mike?
Yeah, so you're referring to a previous study that did look at that specific last in line and understanding what the needs were. And so that finds that study did show a benefit cost ratio greater than 1 for a grade separation without any consideration of a facility in this location. So from that standpoint, there are benefits to that. However, the addition of 30 rail cars is really only adding seconds of time to those existing train movements. And so while it does help improve that benefit, overall, this site wouldn't be the reason that you would absolutely have to. I mean, quite frankly, a rail crossing that crosses a U.S. highway at grade is pretty unique from that standpoint, regardless of the additional 30 cars. And so as you think about a car, that's, it's really a matter of seconds as it gets those extra cars in and out across the highway.
Okay, I'm maybe not following that exactly. Like I say, I may want to follow up on that directly. But knowing that there is an issue there now, and knowing that we will have more trucks, and there will be a somewhat longer delay, what in the end does that impact mean for us? Because the other locations, I think you've got great information. I just don't understand that one.
Mr. Veen, knowing that trucks that are coming off of the interstate, turning east onto Gateway, are most likely then going to be turning north onto 42nd Street prior to the railroad tracks, won't that flow be continuous even if there are trains there?
Yeah, I think that's where a majority of it will go. It just depends on, I guess,
if the rest of the traffic builds in.
Yeah, sure. That would be the only thing. I prepare that because that would just be a future expensive project. Mm-hmm. We started looking at that a little bit through the MPO before. I just would like to know what the continuation of that should look like, so we have awareness is all I was looking.
You're looking into...
Additional questions, Mr. Weber? No. I have a question for Mr. Bittner. And I know this is probably a silly question, but I assume when you're taking your study, you're comparing actual truck traffic versus any vehicular traffic, because trucks obviously take longer time to stop, take them more time to speed up and go through intersections. And so I am concerned about that North Washington and 27th Avenue North intersection. Of course, we can always go in later and add something, and I'm sure we will be watching it very closely. But to me, although it meets 0 of 8 criteria, it's still, I have a hard time believing it. I mean, I believe your study. I don't understand how that something isn't necessary there.
And you don't want small business?
Yeah, sure. So as you think about that traffic control device in particular, and I guess maybe just take a step back and answer your first question. Yes, our traffic models are designed to specifically understand the difference between vehicles and trucks. Understanding, yes, that traffic signals, the startup and stop times are very different, but also just from a queuing perspective, they just take up a lot more space in our turn lanes, and so we need to be able to accommodate that. And that's why you do see a number of extended turn lanes, and one of those is 42nd Street and Highway 2, to be able to get those trucks over and out and wait till they can make that left turn in advance of that railroad crossing location as well, to kind of tie it back into the previous line of questioning. But back to 27th Avenue specifically, the reason being is a lot of our traffic is, either it's turning into 27th Avenue. So as we have that left turn lane, we pull the trucks from the traffic stream and they're able to wait for a gap. And so they're really only looking for southbound through traffic to be able to find that gap. And so those are some of the numbers that they look at as you start to determine if, what they're called as warrants, warrant for a traffic signal, warrant for an all-way stop control, to be able to determine if those criteria are met. That left turn lane should help, separate that traffic from a safety perspective. Maybe there's benefits to, southbound right if you wanted to add some extra layering from those coming from the north as well. But that wasn't low enough volume that it didn't meet the specific criteria that DOT looks at. And it's pretty black and white to meet those criteria as they set forth today. So that's what those recommendations are, certainly based on that. I do understand the nuance of how that all works from a perception, but also just an operational standpoint too.
Thank you, Mr. Bittner. Mr. Weber, yes, sir?
Yeah, I recall when we approved the Walmart out on Gateway, and I don't believe we even asked about traffic impact study at that time. And yet, if I'm understanding the data correctly, we currently have 10,000 combined cars and trucks as a result of the Walmart there on Gateway, 6,000 as a result of the truck stop. Fufeng is only going to be adding an average of 400 in comparison. Did I get those numbers right? And then I've got another question.
How much is the citizens of
Yes, I'm a little higher on the overall trips, 580 plus 300, but in the scale of things, you absolutely got it all correct.
Yeah, in comparison, the impact of Fufeng is really minimal, far less than I was anticipating. With the other studies that we're looking at, the other aspects of the development agreement, odor, air quality, et cetera, we'll continue to receive additional data, but with the traffic study, can we anticipate any additional data, or is this kind of where we're at now on traffic study? Is there any more that we would be getting, Mr. Grasser or Mr. Bittner?
I think if I can, I think at this point in time, we've got the best information available from the development as far as what kind of traffic they're going to generate and things. The next step is part of that MOU agreement that basically says, we need to operate within the parameters of the data that you provided us. Otherwise, we need some mitigation techniques and whatnot, from the developer, just to make sure we stay within, the representations that we currently have.
So in closing then, the impact of Walmart was multiples of this, and it's not something that we discussed or that we've even noticed really. We haven't gone back to do that, and yet the hysteria around Fufeng would suggest that this is going to be some terrible impact on our community. Thanks for the information, Mr. Grasser.
Any other questions related to the traffic study? Is there a motion to receive and file? Moved by Weber. Is there a second? Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Mr. Weigel. There's a motion and a second to receive and file the study. Any other comments or questions? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. I'm sorry, Mr. Veen, one more, you have another comment?
Yeah, just a quick question. I mean, this is between now and city council next week. If we have questions, we should be able to get those answered.
Yes, certainly. If there are additional questions, please send them to city staff.
But right now, we're receiving and filing this study.
Right, and it's preliminary, so we have to, the final next week. So there's a motion and second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries unanimously. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bittner. Item 210, Fufeng Highway 81 Task Orders, Special Assessment Districts. Mr. Grasser.
Okay, again, good evening. These are the first batch of projects we're actually going to be creating districts and planning on actual construction in the area. I'm going to bounce around a little bit, so this may be a little bit confusing. I think it's actually going to work out better in the end as far as understanding the process, but just bear with me. I'm going to be bouncing through some of the staff reports a little bit. First of all, just explaining some of the special assessment process. It's a specific process prescribed by state statutes relative to how you got to go through and create special assessment districts, the items that need to be included, those types of things. I will note, I won't go through all of them, but I will note that part of the responsibilities are, number one, the city council creates the actual assessment district itself, and you go through and you approve the process of the bidding and things like that. On the side of that, there's a kind of a check and balance thing where you have the Special Assessment Commission actually meets as a separate body and determines how to distribute benefits of the project. Benefits translate into costs, but those, I just wanted to mention that those are two different and separate actions. Again, you control the district, they control the assignment of benefits. They will meet and do a preliminary distribution of benefits. They will comment before benefits actually get assigned. It's after the project is basically complete. They'll have hearings usually in the fall. I think they're usually about the end of September, so that they actually have the public hearings. They go through and certify the actual special assessments. So in this case, these projects, certification is probably a couple years down the line, just because of the size of the project. So anyway, that's just a real basic. Maybe I should stop there. Are there any questions on just kind of the basic operation of the Special Assessment District itself?
Any questions? Mr. Weber?
The term benefits really, it means charges. The distribution of benefits, determining who's going to benefit from the project, consequently who will be charged a special for the project. Is that correct?
Correct. And benefits, when they translate that, are a little bit different, but they ultimately do result back in costs.
Thanks.
So in this case, I'm going to go through just the general. If you look at your staff report, we have the engineer's report, and that's one of the things that's required under state statutes. We have create an engineer's report, and I'm just going to scroll past it here for now. Again, this is the actual engineer's report itself. It has certain data in it, a description of the project, location, cost, feasibility. Again, I'm going to scroll back to it, but I'll come back to it. This is actually the special assessment district that we are proposing that would follow the city policies now in creating the district. I will note, under creating districts, we have a policy that if part of a lot is in the district, we take the whole lot in the district. Then we let the Special Assessment Commission determine, how to assign benefits. And I'll talk about that a little bit right here. You'll see there's kind of an odd jog here where there's a lot that actually isn't in the district. And the reason for that is that I think there's a break point on the drainage on Washington Street, somewhere in this vicinity, where the water flows north and the water flows south. So because that lot is on an area where the water is draining north, it's not going to go to the pond. So therefore, they're not even in the district. The next lot over may have part of it in the district and part of it not. Again, that'll be distributed, that'll be detailed out with the assessment commission, but because there's a part of it that's in the lot, all of the lot is in. Also note here lot 2, which is the main development lot. Again, there's areas in here that are prescribed by under the, when the Corps of Engineers did the flood protection project, they had a general break line in these rural areas. And in this case, part of the water will flow north and part of the water will flow south into the English Coulee. Again, the lot, the entirety of the lot is brought into the district, but that doesn't mean the entire lot will drain into the pond. Again, the Special Assessment Commission will work with them detailing out kind of where we think the break lines are that would go into the actual pond. Areas outside of the pond, I would assume, would not get any benefits at this time because they'll have to be addressed at a later date.
See, the Corps of Engineers screwed that one up.
The last thing, again, the component of the engineer's report is the timetable for special assessments. Again, this one identifies its stormwater improvement with the pond. We are here, we're just in the process here of approving, we would approve the engineer's report, directing preparation of plans and specs advertised for bid. Again, I'll go to committee here this week and council in a week. There's another set of processes in here where we track, when the bids are going to be prepared and advertise, things like that. You will see it again here on this schedule in August on approving the plans and specs. That's a necessary component of that. And again, it goes on to the following city council. On this schedule here, we're looking at opening bids the end of September and awarding the contract, again, basically at the council level would be October 3rd. I'll mention that some of these timetables in this, well, I'm trying to figure out where I should jump into details. Part of the timetable that's running, that's directing this is the fact that a stormwater pond, it's a large excavation project. They'll be excavating probably with scrapers and/or backhoes to get the clay out. In our area, a lot of times our soil is very saturated, it's very wet, it's hard to work with. And so what we found over the years is one of the best techniques to get the lowest cost on that type of work is to do it essentially kind of as winter work. Now, that's not dead of the winter work, but usually what they try to do is you know, as you go through the fall, it gets cold, the ground gets firmer, it starts to freeze. And the good contractors can kind of, we call it chase the frost down, so that they've got some support for their equipment. And again, so this kind of anticipates that, and we're trying to hit that sweet spot where the contractor will be able to hit the ground and do some of that work, again, as frost is going into the ground. There's also, this is just a general sketch, what our expectation of the pond right now. This may change. We're still looking at this finger that's coming up here on the pond, whether it's more cost effective to do an open excavation or pay for it as a pipe. Concrete pipe has gotten really, really expensive, especially of late. Some past history here. This is a map of quite a few lots. They're not all applicable to this particular project. But back in May, there were a number of discussions in the spring about special assessments and things. And so this map was created to identify where you are on this spreadsheet. And I'm not going to go through the spreadsheet, but this spreadsheet was approved by City Council on May 16th. Again, I will only point out that you know, we have a whole host of projects listed in here that will have some level of potential special assessments.
Breaking every spending order.
The line, basically this line here, if you look at all of the items on the left-hand side of the line, are costs that we are anticipating to be picked up sometimes through various state programs or locally. The items on the right-hand side of the spreadsheet would be those actual special assessments that would be expected to be levied. And in this case, I'm looking for the pond, the special assessments in here are zero for most of the properties. So what we're doing with the special...
Mr. Grasser, just to confirm, and all of these documents are currently available on the Grand Forks City's website. This is item 210 on tonight's agenda. It's right there in public view. Thank you, Mr. Grasser.
And again, this is back for reference. What we're trying to capture with the special assessment, we're going back and trying to capture the intent of that document. You'll see that there are dollars that some of our updated cost estimates are different than what we had back when this was originally done in May. And so, but again, what we're trying to do is capture the intent of this document as part of the special assessment. With that, I'll kind of go back up and walk through the engineer's report that gets us to that point. So this is the engineer's report where we look at the dollars of the project, and this is one of the more complicated ones that you will see, or some that are associated with these projects in general are the most complicated that you'll see. So your life as a council person with special assessments will get easier to read than this for the most part. So I'll go through this thing kind of line by line. And in concept, we've captured the costs that are generating cost to the project, and we're going back through and subtracting out cost offsets, I'll say, to the project. So at this point, we're assuming our latest estimate is the construction cost and some associated costs with that is about $3.7 million. We have a little over $300,000 in professional fees for doing the design and construction inspection. That'll actually be the next item on your agenda. So we're hiring professional services to do that. There is a land acquisition component that we're purchasing the property that's now owned by Fufang. We're purchasing that property that would serve, we call it the Highway 81 and other areas, and reimbursing them for the cost of that land. The Fufeng themselves are actually donating the land component of the pond. So again, there's a donation that, and so this cost only represents the purchase of that component that serves, we'll call it Highway 80, it's Highway 81 and 27th Avenue South combined. There is as we excavate, we would like, we're planning on keeping as much of the excavated material on site. We know there's a lot more than we can hold on the site, that we just don't have the land to do it. So that dirt will be exported, and we're looking at taking it to the landfill. And so what we're planning that we would charge the landfill, the hauling component to get the dirt, because it takes more money to haul it by truck from here to the landfill. The landfill will reimburse those additional costs of hauling. So it should hold, the concept is to hold the project neutral, basically as if you're basically just excavating the dirt and putting it on site. So that would be an additional income source that would reduce the special assessment component. That gives us a project subtotal of about $3.6 million. Now, on a pond this large, the normal city contribution would be 20%. And so we're incorporating the 20% component on the pond, reducing, again, the overall cost. So the special assessment subtotal would again normally be about $2.9 million. The special assessment overhead, which covers the work that finance has to do, engineering has to do, there's various legal and publication processes and things that have to be done. That's 19%, and that's been adjusted downward because we are using consultants to do a lot of the work. So you will see on other projects that 19% might be 21 or 22 or some other number. But in here, when we're using a consultant, it's 19%. So that's an additional cost. So now we have a total special assessment. The amount that would be special assessed is $3.46 million. Now, you'll see then the next line is less the unique city assumption of special assessments for the Highway 81 area. That's $1.8 million that would essentially pay, that's what was the cost assistance that was represented on that spreadsheet. So we're anticipating at this point in time that would be $1.8 million. The actual remaining that would be actually special assessed is about 1.6, and that would be assessed to only to lot 2 and block 1. That's the Fufeng lot. So right now, they're the only ones that we're anticipating will actually have a special assessment assigned to them. The others, we're going to go through the special assessment process and assign what the normal benefits would be, but there won't be any billing for that assessment. Now, there is a caveat, because the Special Assessment Commission is a separate body, they do have to concur with the $1.6 million. I'm not sure why they would have a different opinion on it. Pond drainage is usually pretty straightforward in that you're basically assigning costs on the contributing area. So the larger lot pays more than the smaller lot. There's other variables in there which I won't get into. This is all commercial land, so it's all pretty much equivalent as far as runoff percentages and things like that.
Would you be willing to take any questions at this time, or do you want to wait?
Yes, I'm going to stop. Basically, that's about what I had, so I'll take any questions.
Mr. Weber? President Sandy, thanks. The land purchase for the stormwater pond, the idea that the city is going to be buying land from the project developer, it's easy to be cynical about that, but this is a common process for the city when we're building stormwater ponds, isn't it? Can you just explain that for a bit?
If there's a normal process, the normal process is a developer comes in and they have a certain amount of land that they have to provide a pond for. And we tell the developer basically, you have to donate the amount of land you need to serve your area of development. What's unique here is we're creating a pond to serve an area outside the development. It's somebody else's property. And so under the development agreement that we have, we're actually purchasing that, from the property owner, again, and that goes into the special assessment component. But the component of the property that is serving their property is being donated.
So property owners in the area who will benefit from this pond, we're not using any of their land, we're using land that Fufeng has purchased to benefit these. Very good. I don't know what the laughter's about, but, and then how much of the overall cost for this pond is paid by Fufeng, and how much will be paid by property owners who will benefit from this pond? And you've just explained it, but if you could answer that again.
Again, you can see that the total cost that we would end up distributing would be about $3.4, almost $3.5 million. Again, if you look at that spreadsheet, it does a lot of accounting, but it basically gets the property owners to zero, all the property owners except for the owner of Lot 2, Block 1, which would be the Fufeng. They were not part of that agreement. Their agreement is that they would pay their full share, normal share of a pond, so.
Compared to what we've done in other parts of the city, these property owners, in relation to the storm pond, are getting an amazing deal, right? They're not having to pay for this, right?
Correct. They're basically going back to zero relative to.
Right. I don't know why people would disagree with that, because that's simply the case. That's the facts there. Right. Okay, thanks.
Mr. Grasser, so any other comments related to 210? Mr. Veen?
If Fufeng property wasn't being developed and the area was annexed, that's not maybe the question I wanted to ask. There's a lot of, I guess that spreadsheet you showed a lot of different properties and a lot of different contributions to this storm sewer project, right?
Correct.
That is, well, not typical? Is that how you would describe it?
Well, usually we're not creating a pond to serve an existing area. I mean, there is, but not usually on this kind of scale. I think to the original question you were almost asking is, if this were a standalone and we're creating and providing city services for this area, we would need land to put in a pond in order to be compliance with our stormwater discharge permit from the Department of Environmental Quality. And to do that, obviously you'd have to obtain land, so you'd have to purchase land from somebody to, again, provide the physical capacity to, build a stormwater pond.
But do you need a pond for existing buildings?
You don't. There's nobody.
Thank you. Mr. Veen, any additional comments or questions? I'm sorry. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Okay. Thank you, Mr.
I
Veen.
think that the natural follow-up would be it is existing, it's now in the city limits. What would trigger when a pond would have to go in?
Basically, the requirements say that if you're doing any kind of expansion and you're part of a contiguous area, which this basically is, you would trigger that you need to meet stormwater quality requirements. Part of that is what we talked about with S&S Trucking. They've got some development plans out there. If we didn't have a pond, they'd have to try to figure out how to do all of this stormwater attenuation on their own sites, which takes up quite a bit of property and things, because you can't make the ponds very, very deep. So this will actually, when any of these properties develop along highway, do an expansion of any sort, basically we've got the stormwater quality component that they would otherwise need to address already completed here.
Stormwater going now?
Mr. Grasser, what are we going to be doing with the clay and dirt that's going to the landfill? We're not just filling in a hole out there with that, right?
No, they need topsoil and clay, basically. Part of it is for their daily cover operations, and part of it would be for eventually to do a clay cap. They need to put in, I don't remember, like 3 feet of clay or something like that in order to produce a clay cap when you close up a landfill. So,
and otherwise we'd have to purchase that.
We would otherwise be purchasing that from other sources, correct?
Yes, exactly. So we're acquiring needed materials anyway.
Right. We're taking advantage of the fact it's got to be, loaded and whatnot anyway. So what we would be paying for would be the hauling component of it.
Right. So. Thank you. Any additional questions or comments related to 210? Is there a motion to approve the, yeah, Mr. Veen?
Is that, are we just looking at
Correct.
Did you want to continue on, Mr. Grasser?
I can.
Great.
So item B is the engineering agreement for the stormwater pond. This includes the costs of the design and the construction inspection, staking, all those kinds of activities. And one of the things to be aware of is, and it goes back to some of the development agreement, once we create a special assessment district, now we can start to capture those costs within the special assessment district and assign those back. Again, it can become a lien on the property. So part of the front end discussion documents on the letter of credit is to capture those types of costs that might have occurred before this assessment district is created, so we can have a way of recouping that. You'll see sometimes that we'll actually create a special assessment district and we won't have a project to bid for like 6 months, simply because we're trying to create it so we can start capturing those development costs that otherwise, on an internal city project, you really don't see it. We just absorb it on the engineering department, but when you're hiring consultants, you need to have a funding source to pay those bills.
And President Sandy, is it adequate to just have a single motion for A, B, C, and D? Is that the intention?
Mr. Grasser, were you planning on speaking to C and D as well?
I have a very short discussion on C, but they're all, I'm not going to go through what I just went through. I gave you the background, so.
Please continue.
Again, B would be the engineering agreement for the stormwater pond for Highway 81. Item C is creating the district for the sanitary sewer. And I do just want to, one of the things that is different there, again, we go through different costs, but we're tallying up the totals. We are getting back to what the special assessment here would be about $4.9 million. Then we talk about, if you look on your spreadsheet, there's some columns in there. We're anticipating some state programs. We're talking about a 45% unique potential loan forgiveness, 51%, I'm sorry, on the loan forgiveness, and then 49% basically that the city would pick up in order to bring all those costs back to zero. Again, the only lot that we're anticipating would have an actual special assessment would be Lot 2, Block 1, which is about $210,000. This is a general, the layout that we're anticipating right now of the sanitary sewer. The lift station is going to be down in here, and these dash lines are all the collection system to go out and service all of the area that's actually in the city limit at this point in time. We have been able to save a few dollars on some of the original with the agreement that we had with S&S Trucking. It gets kind of complicated, but if some of these areas, they're lots, but they operate kind of as one parcel. They act as one entity. They have, overlapping trucking and buildings and things like that. And by utilizing this as under a parcel basis instead of a lot basis, we're actually able to reduce a little bit of our stormwater pipes. There are still, and our cost estimate right now is kind of assuming, I'll call it more or less worst case, where we have, like come up and around and add pipe. There's various discussions we're going to have with property owners that could help us substantially reduce the costs if we have an easement that might shortcut through something, or a construction easement that might make the construction techniques cheaper for the contractor. Other than that, that's about all the, I think, unique items that really went with this report.
Great. So additional questions related to parts A, B, C, and D for 210? Mr. Weber, any questions? Ms. Osowski?
Yes, thanks.
Anything else on 210?
Just for clarification, once we've annexed this property, we are under federal obligations to put in things like stormwater treatment.
I'm not sure they're federal, but we have, the intent of annexing is to provide full services, fire protection, all those kinds of activities.
Very good, thanks.
Thank you. Are there additional questions, Mr. Veen? Mr. Veen, do you have any questions? 210?
Not under no obligation.
Or is there a motion?
I'll move approval of 2.10 A, B, C, and D.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Mr. Weigel. Any other comments? Mr. Veen?
I would. First of all, I appreciate the presentation, Al, you made. I think I understand what you're doing, why you're doing it. Technically, it makes great sense. I mean, this is how we would typically do a project without question. And I think with some of the outside funding that's going toward this project, I think it's maybe not seen this way, but maybe beneficial, because the alternative would have been more costs on the property owners. There is truly that benefit to doing this. But when I first got involved in this thing here and we did our development agreement, I'd made the commitment to many that we wouldn't start construction until we had all the data. And that's my concern. I think the process is good. I think there's a lot of benefit to it, but I've made that commitment not to proceed until we had done the studies, many of that identified in the development agreement. So that's where I am. On one hand, it makes very good sense, but it may be a matter of timing is probably the issue that I have. So.
Why do some businesses have?
Thank you, Mr. Veen. So are there any additional comments, questions? Hearing none, all those in favor of item 210 signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign.
Aye.
Motion carries. Sowski and Veen dissent. Thank you. Item 211, raw water booster station and intake improvements for project 8553. Good evening, Ms. Parvey.
Good evening, Council President Sandy. Tonight, we're just bringing forward the raw water booster station and raw water intake improvements. This is the design agreement with A2S, and then will allow us to look at necessary improvements also for the intake building that the city is looking at doing at our cost. The cost for Fufang will be paid by them. It will allow for the booster station that'll be separate at the water treatment plant. That will serve currently just Fufang development. We will have the capability to add to that in the future if we choose to. And then the improvements at the intake, which just is increasing the pumpage capacity there. We're also looking at currently updating our drought management demand reduction plan, and have been working closely with the mayor and staff on that, as well as the Lake Agassiz Water Authority and working with the city of Fargo and others as we continue to support that project that we've talked about in the past. The design agreement is for $932,000. So we're looking for approval tonight to get started on that.
Thank you, Ms. Parvey. Any comments or questions related to the agreement? The engineering agreement? Any questions? Mr. Reed, question?
Yeah, they do, and I think I have a couple of different angles on this one that I'm concerned about. One of them is the availability of raw water in general, and the other one is the method of getting the raw water to the plant, to the proposed plant. I think both of those are two issues that fall under this general heading. And the latest study that we've been looking at for raw water availability clearly identifies that in a time of drought, we have water shortage. I think very clearly we've looked and seen that the solution to that is the Red River Valley Water Supply Project, which would resolve that issue. We've had many discussions. I've been working for 25 years on this, so I probably have more background on this than people want to or would understand. But we will have annual shortages as we look to the future. If we have a 30-style drought and we look at 2075, that's been documented that we'll have shortages on an annual basis, anywhere from 9 to 69%. The availability of Lake Ashtabula and Red Lake rivers have been diminished by some extensive studying. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't do this. What I am saying is we need to work through this, talk through this, understand this better than where we are today. It's not that we can't, but I think we can't just assume that the water is there. So what I'm trying to do is say, we need to spend some time before we should proceed with using this as the water source. And I got a lot of data I can go through. I'm not necessarily wanting to get into that level of detail, but it is concerning for me, the water availability. And as I've stated, I've been working on this a long time. And there's major issues.
Council President Sandy and Councilmember Bean, Ken and I were just at a meeting this morning at 8 down in Fargo, and you're going to see a presentation that Ken is alluding to regarding the Red River Valley water supply. It's really important to note that the reason why we've been working on this for so long is that we knew we'd have a water shortage in a 1930s era drought. That's why we've been working so hard on it. And I think generally what you'll see in this study is if you extrapolate the city of Grand Forks to 2075, if you embed a 1930s era drought, we're going to have a few years within that 1930s era where we're going to have water shortages. And so that is true. And so really the importance of what you're going to see as early as next week is the Red River Valley water supply is really important. We've always said Fargo is really, really important, right? If we had a 1930s era drought, Fargo's in big trouble. It's obviously our large economic engine. And what the study shows is really if Fargo has water and they discharge to the river, Grand Forks is going to have more than enough water. So really the importance of the Red River Valley Water Supply Project is that the priority should be to get Fargo to have water, and then for Grand Forks as part of our development agreement to make sure that they discharge a certain percentage of that. And if that all happens, we will have enough water in our river system at a 2075 time period in that point. So that's really what we're working on. That's what you're going to see. It's important to know also we've had some other dry periods. The 1930s era time period is the only era in our recorded history where Grand Forks has been short of water. And certainly we do want to make sure that we really hasten with the state that we move forward. I think the importance of this particular agreement is that we're going to use raw water. We're going to have a utility agreement about when and when they cannot use the water supply. And the state has been supportive of this plan. They've been supportive of us using our Red River permit, and they're going to help fund 60% of the cost share, not only for this engineering agreement, but the ultimate construction. So I would ask you to approve this evening. There's more information coming. This is, again, another escrow account where Fufang is going to set aside money in an escrow account for us to move forward. If we come to some conclusion that we can't serve them with raw water, we got to have some sort of basis of why we can't. Right now, you've committed in a good faith way that we would move forward with serving them with raw water as part of the supply, and that we would continue to do diligence as part of it, and that we would continue to engage the state of North Dakota. So I would ask you to approve this. This will just provide more information. And as Ms. Parvey said, in the meantime, you're going to see a drought mitigation plan that's been updated. You're going to be able to see a Red River Valley water supply presentation that has been updated. And the bottom line is this: if Fargo and Grand Forks cooperate and the state participates in the project, this region is going to be sustainable for the next 100+ years, even in the most dire of circumstances.
I think it's important to note, Mr. Phelan, that the Red River Valley Water Supply Project has been one of our top legislative priorities for the last few legislative sessions. So I think we're all on the same page, Mr.
Sandy, I've probably made 30 to 50 presentations at the legislature. I can get into a whole lot of detail that's specific to the need. What I really appreciate is Garrison and Lake Agassiz worked on a new study that brings more clarity to the exceptional details that goes into doing a comprehensive study. Like I said, and Todd and I have had this discussion before, and I mean, the details that come out of the study are very alarming. They show the shortage, What I'm trying to say is there is a solution to that. It is in the Red River Valley Water Supply Project. We have supported that. But the state has not come up with a state funding plan. There's not a local funding plan, and it's $1.4 billion in today's dollars. Also, it's under construction, but there's not enough money that's been going toward it to fund it, fully fund it. That's why I felt not to say no, but we should have a lot more discussion about this, have and see these presentations as we go forward, and then decide what the risk is we want to take to do it. That's where I'm coming from. I'm not saying we shouldn't. I just think it's a big enough deal, we got to take our time and talk about it.
I think the state of North Dakota, I think as Mr. Phelan pointed out, Fargo is the economic engine for the state of North Dakota. And if the state let me rephrase this, if the city of Fargo became so that they were in a desperate situation for water, the state legislature and the governor would never let them go without water. They just wouldn't. And as long as they have water, we will have water. So although it is important to read the studies and watch the information, I don't think past actions of the state legislature are reasonable predictors of what their future holds, because in times of crisis, they will act, I believe.
Mr. Sandy, the only problem is the project is so big, it's going to take 6 to 10 years to build. You can't wait for crisis and then start building.
No, and I think we will continue to have it as a top priority, and we will continue to talk about it with them. And I agree with you. We should see the study that is going to be provided and use that as one of the many decision points in this whole process. Mr. Weber, additional comment?
Mr. Phelan, Mr. Gaustad, maybe this is a chicken egg question, or maybe I'm misunderstanding it in that way. What we're being asked to do tonight is approve the construction, the work necessary for a raw water intake. And what's been alluded to several times tonight is the utility agreement by which we would charge for this raw water. And we don't have the utility agreement yet. We don't have all the information necessary to draw that up. As we looked at earlier, we need additional data. So help me to understand how doing the development of the raw water intake before having the utility agreement, is that a chicken and egg, or why is it necessary to do the work now before we have the agreement?
I think, Councilmember Weber, number one, it's timing. You know, part of your development agreement says we would work on all these due diligence items in a good faith way so that we can find out what the ultimate solutions are. The only way we're going to find ultimate solutions is to study them, and so that's why we're asking you this evening to work on the specifics of the intake, and then also work on the specifics of the pump station. All of those will ultimately come in as part of a utility agreement that will say, you know, what's our responsibility, when we're going to run those things. But really the key right now is to keep the design moving forward so that we have more specifics to discuss with the state of North Dakota, with Fufang, and as part of a utility agreement. Otherwise, we're going to be, if we don't start moving forward, we're not going to have a lot of the answers that we're going to have. And certainly, we should all know that if the 1930s, this should be obvious to all of us. If the 1930s came back to Grand Forks and Fargo and the Red River Valley, if it came in 2075, we're going to be challenged. That should be no surprise to anybody. So what we're trying to do in advance of that is to try to mitigate that. You should know if the 1930s occurred in Grand Forks, we're going to have a lot of other issues other than water in our area. It's going to be existential.
And clearly, the utility agreement wouldn't have any industrial user drinking all of our water while we're dying of thirst.
Certainly, we're not going to allow that.
Residential users would have water.
We wouldn't allow that today with our industry, and so we're not going to allow it tomorrow, and we're certainly not going to allow it in a Fufang agreement.
Right. I share Mr. Veen's concern about we want as much information as possible before we move forward with the construction, and it would be nice if we could have all of the information and then the next day start the construction, but it's going to be more fluid than that. This raw water intake, if we move forward with what you're asking for tonight, and then the Fufeng project is terminated for whatever reason, what use is a raw water intake for the city?
Maybe before I ask, Ms. Parvey did say there's some improvements that we're looking to make as part of this task order, updating the intake. The part of the intake itself that is Fufeng related are the 2 additional pumps, but as part of the staff report, there are some improvements that we're planning to make regardless of Fufeng. But for the intake itself, it's 2 pumps that are going to be placed in there. The pump station out by the new water treatment plant, that's all Fufeng, as Ms. Parvey said. So, a lot of that goes into the escrow account, but I just want to say most of it's Fufeng related, but some of it's just improvements we want to make in and of itself.
Very good. Hi.
I can answer the question, and that's if in the event that the Fufeng doesn't complete its plant, that's what the letter of credit is intended to do. If it does, then the Fufeng portion of this project gets paid through the escrow account as well. Because if you recall, Fufeng was going to pay for their costs with respect to the raw water treatment, and that's the escrow. So this is something that was addressed in the development agreement as well.
Great, thank you.
I'll move approval of the task order number FF06 for the project. Yes.
The raw water booster station intake improvements project 8553. There's a motion by Weber. Is there a second? Second by Weigel. Any other comments? Yes, Mr. Veen?
Yeah, one last comment. I'm hoping, as a minimum, we continue the study, because the facts that I've said are real and they're influential. Having water availability is one of the core things we need to have just to sustain our city, and we can't look at that unless we do it well in detail for what we're going to do and how we're going to do that. So I definitely think, well, I stand behind what I said when I think we need to stop and take a better look at this. The added issue that I have with this here is the 2 30-inch water lines that serve the water plant. One of them is in part going to be converted over to serve Fufeng, which takes away redundancy. That's another piece of the issue that I think needs to have more discussion, and I'm just going to leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Veen. Any other questions or comments?
Council President, I think those are all important items. That is part of the task order we agreed to design to look at all those various component parts in more detail so that you'll have more answers. And then we are planning to have a Red River Valley Water Supply project update at your next, at the City Council meeting in advance of you approving this.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Phelan. Any other comments? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign.
Aye.
Motion carries. Osowski and Veen dissent. Item 212, wastewater treatment plant, CMAR. Mr. Phelan.
Council President Sandy, members of the Committee of the Whole, we had we started a process for the construction manager at risk for the wastewater treatment plant. Again, this is a facility that we intended to make some renewals, and what you authorized us to do, thankfully, is that we could move forward with a construction manager at risk for the wastewater treatment plant. I think this process will meet our needs, and it really came out in the interview process because it's more and more challenging to get contractors that work in heavy industrial facilities like wastewater treatment plant currently right now. This will allow us to not only have a competent general construction manager, will also allow us to bid in multiple packages that will provide more competitiveness, not only locally, regionally, as part of this development. We did go through an interview process. We only had one submitter, as I noted to you, and that was PKG. They're out of Fargo. They're a strong water treatment, wastewater treatment plant construction manager. They are working in projects throughout the upper Midwest. They are recently completing, or soon to complete, the Fargo wastewater treatment plant expansion. That's a $100 million plus project. And so we really fit nicely into their project schedule right now. They're well assured of working at treatment facilities to include wastewater treatment. So, number one, they're qualified, they're excited to engage with us, and I think they're well qualified to move forward. So we're asking you to move forward, and as you recall, we also asked as part of this is that we have an early out phase, which was the phase one project out at the wastewater treatment plant. Those are all the existing improvements we need to make at the existing wastewater treatment plant. That was at $13 to $14 million as part of phase one. Those are all the existing improvements that we need to make at the existing wastewater treatment plant. The construction manager, we would bring back an agreement that they would move forward with design and bidding of that particular component part. The longer-term strategy we're asking to move forward with PKG is under a pre-construction, and that's really to allow the further expansion of our wastewater treatment plant that we needed. And so under that, they're going to be brought onto the team along with our designers, which are A2S right now as part of the design. So we're asking for both components that PKG would be brought in under the phase one improvements of the existing wastewater treatment plant, and then under the further phases of expansion. This evening, so we're asking, that's the approval. You will see coming back to you agreements with PKG in both areas, both phase one improvements and also the pre-construction improvements that we want to make as part of the longer term of our wastewater treatment plant. This comes at a time when we are going to have about $38 million of our debt service is coming off, has or will be coming off of our wastewater treatment plant. So a lot of this is the renewal of our facility for the next 20 to 30 years now that we've really gotten through most of the early life of our treatment plant that has been operating over the last 20 plus years. And so that's this agenda item. It's really to select PKG under these two areas, and then further agreements will be coming back to you as City Council.
Thank you, Mr. Phelan. Any questions?
I'll move approval.
Moved by
I'll
Hubbard, second by Lunsky. Comments, Mr. Veen?
Mr. Phelan, what's the approximate timing? When do you think we'd be going to bid on this?
Council President Sandy, Council Member Dean, I think under phase one, we would look to try to bid that by this fall. And that's that 13 to 14 million. That's a lot of the site piping, some of the renewals as part of our facility. The longer term strategy, which is the expansion part, we always said it's 13 to 14 million. There's probably another, 40 million for expansion. That's going to be a longer term. I would anticipate that at the earliest starting next spring. But I think early out, try to get some of that initial phase one work done while we work through what's the best strategy of expansion of the wastewater treatment plant as part of some of the attached materials, and we'll give you more details. You remember we had the two concepts. We were going to try to retrofit those 4 reactor tanks. We've come up with an alternative strategy as to build something new adjacent to the existing wastewater treatment plant, and they're calling it an MBR or membrane bioreactor. Both our design engineers and also PKG came back, that's probably the best option that we have. We can keep our wastewater treatment plant functioning while we add additional capacity without getting inside those reactor tanks itself. We'll be, as part of that pre-construction agreement under that, phase 2, they will be working with our designers to really maximize the best way to move forward with construction with that, more the longer term development.
Yeah, and I was kind of concerned about the pricing and what we're having for materials and material costs and what inflation and where, if that's stabilizing better now as we look at that when we time construction.
Yeah, I think what we're hearing, short of something really bad happening in our economy that none of us want, I think it's here until into 23 and 24, so I think we're going to be challenged on all the bids that we're doing right now. And I don't wish for anything bad to happen that would suddenly free up a lot of projects and resources in our economy, because that would be very painful. But it's really a challenging time right now in the economy, in the construction world, with all the supply chain issues. And one of the options that we moved away from, remember we were going to retrofit those bioreactors, our existing 4 with that IFAS, but they really came back with some of the rare metals like nickel are really in the Ukrainian region, and those are going to be hard to come by. And so there's simple, essential things like that are just hard to get right now because of all the things that are going on in our world. So I think this is a better alternative strategy is what we're going, but we'll come back with more details so you can really kind of refine what we're doing. And I think the important part of this agenda item is we're going to add a construction manager. Is going to help us. How do we actually get this constructed? How can they bring together a construction team that can actually make it happen under a reasonable time frame? The other thing that we need to do is what we told PKG is we really want them to start as part of the pre-construction so that if our timeline is not reasonable, hey, we cannot get this done not only for the citizens of Grand Forks and our businesses, but for the Fufang project, we need to go back to Fufang to say, here's a more reasonable time frame to get this constructed, and that we can bring that back to Fufang. So we want to bring them on sooner rather than later.
Great. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none. Item 212, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Who's unanimously, I think? Yeah, thank
Keep adding
you.
more money to the area,
Okay.
so we don't exist.
So,
Move to adjourn.
moved by Weber, second by...
You can adjourn, and you can shut off the cameras, and you can shut off the microphone, but you need to hear a few things. Mr. Thielen?